Everybody, welcome, welcome. We're starting on time today. Let's see. Am I live? Can someone tell me if I'm live? That would be awesome. Any kind of chats? Okay, I think I am. Should be live. So, yep, cool. All right, awesome. I'm live. Hey, hi everybody. It's me, David Soto, Side Mountain. This is the Colorado Modular Synth Society February meetup. This is the first one since last year, and even then, it's been a while. So it's good to see, or at least be back in broadcasting to you all. I hope everybody's doing well today. Thank you so much for joining. This is going to be a really interesting talk and discussion. So I'm glad you're here. Just a couple of notes, just to note, if you're just starting, if you're going to come back and watch this later, or if you are watching this later, we will add some chapters from the talk afterwards to help you navigate the discussion, so you can go back and learn more. We're going to get totally nerdy and totally deep, talking about recording, mixing, and mastering modular synths, and that includes Eurorack to Buchla, whatever. But we're just dealing with that very interesting instrument that we all are in love with. So let's talk about that for sure. So on today's show, we're going to have a panel of people. We also had a pre-recorded interview with Nathan Moody, which we'll be sharing later on in the show. And we'll get some reactions, some thoughts from the panel to talk about that as well. We also have a special music guest. Heckseven is going to be performing a couple sets for us today. So this is going to be a lot of fun. Please drop some questions in chat as we're doing this talk, and we'll try to pull in your questions. And if you have any thoughts or something, we'll try to pull those in as well. And as always, you can always keep the conversation going in the comments or on our Discord. So let's get into it. So without further ado, let me pull in the most awesome panel we can put together. It's pretty amazing. So here we go. All right, here we go. Hello. All right, so we unmute everybody here. There we go. All right, cool. Am I unmuting? All right. So welcome everybody. This is the panel we have today for the Colorado Modular Synth Society's meetup. We're going to be talking about recording, mixing, and mastering modular synths. So with me today is my co-host Christoph, aka Monoscene. Thank you. He's in the background pulling a lot of the levers, keeping this ship floating. And then we have Aaron Youngberg, aka Double A.
Hello.
And yeah, Double A's played on our show a couple times. He's played on some other shows. He's a performer as well as audio engineer. He has his own studio in Fort Collins, and he has like over 15 years of experience doing that sort of stuff. Right, Mike?
That's correct. Yes. Yep.
Okay.
Perfect.
That's awesome. We also have Alex Anderson, aka Nasty Nachos, from WMD. If you haven't caught Alex's videos from WMD, they're really amazing stuff. He's really got some really amazing insight on all things modular synth. But he also has other synths, and he's played with other instruments, so you know a lot about this and doing it yourself. And really excited to have you here, Alex. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. Heck7's in the corner there, getting ready to play. He's hanging out, and he's also in Colorado, and he has a bunch of cool DIY stuff, and we'll hear some music from him soon too. Rosanna Caban, welcome, coming from Brooklyn, Planet Brooklyn. Thank you so much. She has a lot of background in doing mixing as well, and you've been in you were in a band. Some people know Psychic Twin, but you've also been really a part of Women in Sound, and I first saw you in a webinar for Sound Girls, and
nice.
yeah. So there's some videos of you. Yeah, so thanks so much for being here. That's awesome. Thank you. Tom Butcher's here as well, from Patchworks. Um, Tom, you do all kinds of stuff besides the founder of Patchworks. You also are a musician, and you are you like creating or designing instruments too, or I was trying to
Yeah, I've
understand.
developed technology for music in the past, electronic music, some with AI and some with signal processing. But mainly these days, I'm one of the co-founders of Patchworks. So that and my music endeavors is pretty much what I'm doing most of the time. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Thanks so much. That's awesome. And we have also just popping in right now is Grant Overbridge, aka Memory Bell.
Overbridge, Outer
Yeah,
Bridge.
what did I say?
Overbridge.
Outer
Great Electron Overbridge.
Electron.
That's right.
Electron. Definitely on my
TM.
mind. Yeah. Grant's been, he actually mastered my album, Forming Hall, and also some other stuff that he's worked on. And he has his own. He records too, and you also have a big background in recording and mixing as well.
Yeah.
So welcome. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm a little late.
It's all good. It's all good. This is live. So this is our panel. So yeah, we are I was thinking about the way this kind of going down would be. We kind of think about it through the workflow. So thinking about mixing and recording, that process, and then we'll talk about that, and then get into mastering at the second half. But I'm sure some of that will kind of overlap just because of how things go. So yeah. So one thing I asked everybody before we were getting started for this show is I was asking people what was like their first recording devices, and I thought that was kind of interesting. Kind of like what kind of drew you in to start recording stuff, and what were those devices like? And I'll just share real quick like which was mine, which is funny. So this is Magnavox was mine. I remember like
You're sick, dude.
Yeah, well, this is one of those things where it was pretty awesome because I'll leave it up there for a second. Yeah, it had two tape decks, which was like pretty awesome at the time, and being able to bounce stuff back and forth is really fun. And it had like this funky EQ, and of course a bass boost, which I have no idea what it was really for. But like I used to like make all my mix tapes and walk around the neighborhood playing like Public Enemy, which was really fun. That was like one of my early things, and I had no idea. And I'm not really like an expert about recording. That's probably as DIY and weird as I could get when I was that young. But yeah, that was one of my first things. Monoscene was showing me his, and can you tell me what the heck this thing is? You said you hooked it up to your TV?
Yeah. So I grew up in Germany, so this is a European version of one of those top-loading cassette players recorders, and it had a 5-pin DIN jack on the back, and it looked nothing like any of the other stuff that my parents had, like no RCA plugs or whatever. So we went to this like store, and yeah, you could buy this DIN plug, and you could hook it up to the TV and actually tape stuff off the TV with that. I think there were two pins for audio. I looked it up the other day. 2 pins for audio, and then it's also has some other like audio coming back out, so it's like multi-function, whatever. But yeah, I was recording stuff off TV with that.
What were you doing with those recordings? Were you just doing this?
Good question. I don't remember.
Collecting samples.
It was in I don't know, 1984 probably. So I wish I still had those tapes, but I look every time I go back at my parents' tapes are still there, and they're not, unfortunately.
Those are the found tapes.
So how old were you when you were playing with that tape recorder, Christoph?
Should I date myself? 6.
Yeah, I didn't do it I didn't ask for that reason, but now I know.
Yes, I was 6.
Cool.
And it had a microphone on it, so then my brother and I is a couple years younger. We would just record stupid stuff on it, and it was a lot of fun. I remember that.
That's awesome. Alex, let me show yours. This is your.
Yeah,
awesome.
it's a tape recorder as well. It's a mono tape recorder, just took one mono sound. My mom had one. My mom had it to record. She would record like country songs, and she was a clogging dance instructor. So she got that so she could slow it down, and everyone could learn the steps at a slower pace. And then when I was really young, I would just like same thing as Christoph. I would just record like myself playing a guitar, just all open strings into it, just because I loved hearing it come back. And then I would mess around with the pitch and stuff like that. And then as I got older and started playing instruments, I would record one part onto it, and then I would play that recording through a mixer onto a mini disc recorder that my brother had, and I would play another part on top of that. And that was like my not so mini disc. Look at that thing. Look how huge it is.
Yeah.
But we had that recorder, and so I had this really cheap ghetto DIY multi-track system that I would do when I was young, just to try and replicate myself, I guess.
What were you trying to? What sound were you trying to make? Who were you trying to like mimic or?
Oh, dude, I was just doing like pop punk stuff most of the time. But like, so I'd play the drums and then I'd play the guitar. But I do have like a recording my dad just gave to me of like my first ambient piece that I ever did. And I used the recording, I used the reverb on the mixer, and I would like play the guitar with a screwdriver, and I made all these weird sounds. And that was super fun too. But yeah, the same idea was just back and forth, add more noise each time.
Yeah, you should put that out.
It's so bad.
Is it, or is it so good?
I'll let you decide.
Yeah, let me know. So drop me the WAV file sometime for sure. Tom, I think I have yours keyed up here. Look at this beauty. Oh,
yeah, look at that thing. It belonged to my mom, but yeah, kind of like the other cassette recorders. It had a radio. It could record from the radio. I would actually call up the radio station and say, "Oh, would you please play, I don't know, Van Halen Jump or whatever the song, or Pointer Sisters I used to love." And I would just wait for it to come on and then record, song after song into my little tapes, So I also did the bouncing between two cassettes a little bit later, like you're saying, Alex. And I had two old cassette decks, and they actually didn't play at the same speed. So I was trying to figure out, like, why is everything going flat over time? Because I was switching the cassettes out. Anyway, live and learn. Yep, that was the first one.
I also used to call the radio station to get a song played, in like it was pure gold if I can get my recording just right when they said, "Oh, this came in from David from such and such neighborhood." I'm like, "Yeah, I got it." That was like, oh, that was so cool. It made my mixtapes that much neater, for sure. Oh yeah, I remember that. Rosanna, look at this thing. Oh,
yes.
what's going on there?
The M-Box. You know what, though? As everyone's showing these like original recording devices, I realized that my original one was like the Talk Boy toy that came out with the Home Alone movie. That was, I was all over that thing.
I have mine in a box right there.
That's nice.
I love that design. It's great. So cool. It's awesome.
That's what I learned how to do digital recording on in college, is the inbox. It's the one.
Yeah. I had no idea what I was doing when I started.
Neither did any of us. I still don't.
Yeah. I didn't see what yours was, or Double A. I don't know what yours was.
Mine was pretty similar to Tom's, except it had two. Yeah, it had two tape decks. I don't know if it had a radio or not, and I don't remember if it was Panasonic or Sony, but I used it primarily to record piano growing up.
Yeah, piano is it was such a puzzle to record, because especially with those devices, it always sounded horrible.
Oh yeah, always. I would experiment with how close or how far away it would need to be. And usually if I was in the way, like my body was in between the recorder and the piano, it always sounded better. Well, better.
Diffused. There you go.
Yeah.
There's
Mine
there's recording.
Mine was the well, I mean, I can't recall the models of that I used to record like radio songs off of. I remember sitting around waiting for some Green Day release that was on some soundtrack, and I couldn't get it on a cassette. So I remember waiting around and finally striking gold, like you're saying, David, about getting that recording on a cassette. And I listened to it over and over and over again. But the first time I recorded, the first recording device was the Tascam 414 when I was in high school. And
Classic.
Yeah, and it was funny to me because it just, I don't know, maybe a year and a half ago I bought it again. And it was just like, I knew where all the buttons were. I mean, it was just kind of like just doing it all over again. Like I just knew the device, just muscle memory came back pretty quickly to it. And I still think it sounds good. I mean, it's got its vibe, and that's what I love about it. It's got a cool vibe, all that stuff. And the mini disc thing, that was probably the thing that got me into recording other people, because I had a mini disc recorder, portable, much smaller than the one that Alex had, and an external mic. And I would go to jam sessions, and I would just record the jam session, and I would come back and listen to it. And it was kind of like a practice tool for me to be able to listen to myself objectively play, and others too, and just see what to improve upon. So that was really fun in the more portable department of having that mini disc recorder. And I still have that in a box somewhere. But yeah.
That's awesome.
So we have a picture of the Talk Boy. That is amazing.
There it is.
There it is.
Dude, Macaulay Culkin sold so many of those, dude.
I know. Poor guy. He should have like a licensing deal for that.
Seriously, yeah. They should have had that. Yeah, especially when they did the second one. They should have just like had like, you know, the Home Alone edition. Well, you know.
Yeah, but that was like one of the ones that could change the tape speed and everything like that. It never sounded great, but it was cool to just like play it back and hear yourself in different pitches and stuff.
Yeah.
I remember like, so I just found I remember stealing these from my dad, you know, and some of them have, you know, different speeds and stuff like that. And I know Heimbach did a whole thing about doing recordings on this.
Dictators.
Those things are great.
Yeah.
They're so fun.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's kind of cool. And I know they had like a mini disc version of this too. And I loved the mini disc. That was a cool format for sure. That was cool. Yeah. So just out of curiosity, because everyone's here, like, you know, does something with audio engineering and stuff like that. When did you know that was like something you wanted to get into, or did you kind of fall into it, or were you like 6 years old and you were like, that's what I'm gonna do one of these days? I want to like make like you know, sound design or whatever, or get into this kind of stuff.
To go first, I guess it kind of fell in my lap out of necessity with the band that I was in, because we were getting such horrible sound live, and I was like, I can figure this out. If I can play this instrument, I can probably figure this out to at least be helpful in a sound check. And so I started doing my research of just learning about different microphones, dynamic condenser, ribbon mics, and then ended up acquiring a PA system and just would set it up at rehearsals and figure out, you know, about feedback and how to fix it at the time and cross my fingers. And then from there, it delved into, again, kind of more of a practicing routine for me, because I wanted to be able to play along with the guitar track. So I'd record myself playing guitar, then I would play over that guitar, and I bought an interface, and I had a microphone from performing live, and so I just started doing that. And then my interface had 4 channels. I had 4 microphones that I could plug in. Well, and I had 3 other friends, so I would divide them all over and put microphones in front of them and start. And this is also, I had gained experience in recording studios from the performance side of things, just recording with bands, performing. And then, so I knew in my mind what I wanted to be able, like tools that I wanted, or tricks that I wanted to be able to learn how to do, like comping a solo together or editing rhythm tracks or that kind of stuff. And just kind of one thing at a time, kind of figured out how to do it. And then eventually somebody asked me to record them, and they were going to actually give me money for it, like a little bit of money. I was like, well, I mean, I guess if you want me to. And so then at that point, it was just about like having a really long XLR cable, sticking somebody in the living room, and having another really XLR cable, sticking that person in the next in the bedroom across the hallway, and figuring out how to get a headphone mixes to them, and from there just kind of learning along the way every step I could, and being fully humbled and also just open to all kinds of constructive criticism, left and right, and then learning and then reading the internets and all that kind of stuff. So it's just kind of out of necessity, and also which generated a huge amount of interest that kind of spoke to me. And in a way, it's kind of like when I'm engineering, it is a fun way of using both sides of my brain, the collaborative kind of creative brain, and also the more technical side of my brain. And that's where I really feel most comfortable, is in that kind of position, using both sides of my brain and using my technical knowledge to be creative. That's also fun. Yeah.
Anyone else get into it out of necessity more so than?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
It was like, for me, I just wanted to be around the music making process without necessarily, like, it was by way of production, by way of wanting to make music and not be the front person, and wanting to be involved with that process without like putting myself in that position, because I don't sing really. So that also, recording with bands and having demos come back or never come back, you know, like go and be like, when are you going to send the mix? And it just never arrived after like a weekend of, you know, putting all our time into something. So I was like, just not interested in putting myself in a position of relying on anybody. Like, I'll fix my own iPhone if I can, my screen when I break it. Like, I'll do everything myself if I can avoid having to like rely on something. So that was one of those things I was like, I'm just going to learn it myself so I don't have to keep, you know, wasting money and wasting time and resources on subpar content, you know?
Yeah, I think for me, my goal was always to make music. You know, I wanted to make songs. You know, I was like songwriting and playing piano, and recording and engineering to me was always just about, you know, it's like a means to an end, right? To capture whatever performance it is, build on it. I also wanted to be able to build songs myself, you know, without a band. And, you know, that's where, you know, many of you have mentioned overdubbing, right? So that's like tracking. That's a recording technique that's, you know, came about with multi-track tape recorders. So for me, it was always a matter of, you know, a means to an end. How do I realize this song idea that I have, or, you know, this idea to layer sounds together? And, you know, some of the best lessons I learned early on were to take some early mixes that I would make and, you know, play them for my dad in the car. And they sounded horrible, right? Because they sounded great on my headphones or, you know, whatever I was monitoring in. But I didn't know how to mix. I didn't know about frequency ranges or doubling up on bass frequencies, all that stuff. So, yeah, it sounded horrible. And the first time I played my dad or my parents a song that has me singing on it when I was an adolescent or something, oh my God, I wanted to hide. Just because in my headphones, right, it sounded so great to me at least, and then anywhere else it just sounded horrible. So, you know, that might be something interesting for us to talk about when it comes to the technique part. You know, how do you develop that skill in the mixing process?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I think that's definitely kind of like the direction I was thinking about. Everyone was talking about the necessity part, because I think for a lot of us who are, you know, getting into, you know, modular synths and stuff, like, you know, you start to, first of all, you just get to that first stage of just learning it and experimenting and having fun. And yeah, maybe you make a few recordings, but at some point, you know, some of us are like, oh, I want to put stuff out. And ever since, you know, especially since the pandemic, you know, I feel like there's been a lot more releases coming out on Bandcamp. I'm seeing a lot more people taking the time to put something out. So there's I think there's a large part of our community that's now saying, I guess I gotta figure this out, or I guess I gotta, like, you know, start getting a better system of recording. Not to say that, like, you know, you have to have a really robust system, but kind of like you're saying, like, you know, there's a few things you start to figure out. One is like, yeah, when you record and you put it in your car, it sounds completely different than in your headphones. which is like I think the most common thing I've heard. You know, like I don't know what happened. It sounded cool when I was making it, and that's all because and everyone's in their headphones. You know, so I think this is kind of where I like definitely at the start is like those early like tips and probably things you've heard before, or you've come across where like what are those common mistakes or those common pitfalls you hit when you first start recording. Yeah. So just for conversation speak, you're talking about the mixing technique and stuff. I think a lot of people are probably starting off recording into like a Zoom or something, right? Like a lot of people are just doing 2 out into that, and there is a lot of that heavy bass muddiness coming out of that. Can someone talk to me about like why that's happening? Or
yeah. Go ahead, Rosanna, please.
Just frequencies cancel each other out. So if you have a lot of different parts going into like a stereo recording interface, basically 8 synths at a time or something, and these frequencies are overlapping, they start to get muddy. Or I mean, that's like there's hours of like the physics of sound and how it's like a physical thing, waves or whatever. But the summary is just that they start to cancel each other out as you layer them if they're taking over the same area in like the frequency spectrum that we can hear.
Yeah, and I would add to that. I think I'm totally correct. The thing that worked for me was an iterative process where I would create a recording and then play at different places. And what I would suggest people do is to be really perceptive. First of all, in modular synthesis, because you're using, presumably filters and oscillators, you should get a sense for what frequencies sound like, right? And how they affect a room. So if you develop that, then taking a recording and playing it at different places, analyze how it sounds different. And also analyze how you would like it to sound. Like maybe use a reference recording. You can use a spectrum analyzer to view the different frequency distributions, and just keep iterating. Like make the next one a little better. Make the next one a little better. And over time, I think if you're perceptive and you work at it, you will develop that skill. Just with the quest of wanting to make things sound better. And another quick suggestion is, with equalization and filters, a lot of people like to boost a lot of times. Resonance can be really notorious for this, or in equalization, it can be really tempting to like really crank up the bass. I cut in EQ way more than I boost. And that has to do with what Rosanna says about, these frequencies, overlapping. So there's a lot to that. Some of it's sound design, some of it's arrangement. But if you develop that ear for frequencies and listen in different places and then apply, how do I correct that? That's the loop that will help you develop the skill.
I agree 100% too with all of that. And I would just add too that just as you might get a new module and you might spend time learning that module and seeing what it can do, I think it's also worth devoting some time to developing your signal chain for recording and trial and error and seeing what's pros and cons and what works, what doesn't, and what the output is, so that when it's time to record, you can hopefully be fairly set up and hit go and get a decent capture to begin with, as opposed to having a great performance and then just to find out that you clipped your input you weren't monitoring your input and you clipped it. That's something that's definitely worth the time investment in, and possibly a financial investment too, if you have the budget, which we can get into that as well. But just kind of having that kind of on the go, ready to go if you're recording yourself. And this is whether it be multi-tracking or stereo track into a Zoom, for example. It's good to have that figured out by spending time and so that you can kind of forget about it. Because the last thing that I want to do when I'm performing recording is, although it's semi-necessary, but I do try to forget about monitoring my level, because I give myself plenty of headroom. I know that at the worst case scenario, I'm still not going to clip. And also giving yourself this is kind of getting a little more technical, but making sure that, you know, if you're digital recording, you know, give yourself some headroom by recording at 24-bit or 32-bit, and also hopefully, I mean, ideally a little bit higher than 44.1 sample rate, 48 or 88.2. I mean, that's all kinds of arguments around how, if that's better or not, like in the perceived output of the final product. But I think definitely the bit depth is a huge plus. So at least going to 24-bit is going to help your headroom all over the map. And ideally, in my opinion, at least jumping up to 48K would help get a higher quality picture. And then that kind of just helps everything a little bit more downstream from there too in post. And then too, talking about like the cancellation that Rosanna was talking about, as part of the process of setting up your recording chain, definitely check your signal in mono to make sure that, to see if anything's canceling. You want to check your mono compatibility, especially with low end. And this is, I guess I'm thinking about this more if you're doing a stereo mix, tracking that. Because and again, this is something that you do when you're investing the time to set up your recording chain, and then investigate. And if you find that all of a sudden something disappears when you check your mono compatibility, then you know there's an issue there, and then you can kind of search out, troubleshoot what phases flipped or what frequencies are canceling each other out, so that then you can just hopefully nip that in the butt, and you don't have to worry about that again later, you know, in post or in any other recordings.
So you bring up a point there about down the stream and in post, because I think you know, I saw your heads nodding when you were talking about cutting out the EQs more than adding. So I think there's something there, right? Because if you hand over this big muddy mess, it's gonna, how's your engineer gonna work with that, right? It's harder to deal with that than acquired a mix. Is that I mean, what's the helpful hints there for, you know, that recording so that it sounds better, or you have more to work with in post? Yeah.
As in like stems, like exporting individual parts.
Yeah, I think we'll, yeah, definitely for like the multi-tracking. But I think what I'm saying is like the reason why those things sound so good is, one's because like you're gonna hear that recording, but there's obviously so much more you're gonna do with post, right? So it sounds like, maybe I was getting this wrong, but like, you know, like acquired a mix with more headroom is you all can work with that much better than if I just, you know, if I just go straight into stereo and throw everything at it and say, oh, they'll clean it up later.
Yeah, like a lot of that has to do with dynamic range, and I'm realizing that we're using a lot of technical terms without explaining them really. So traditionally, records were made in a multi-step process where, you know, you get people in a room, and initially, you know, the musicians would just play around a microphone, one mic. But it evolved to where you capture the recording, sometimes all at the same time, sometimes multiple times, and then you would move on to the step called mixing, which is where you take the balance of all the different parts. You might carve out EQ, you might add reverb, all that stuff, and then you create the final, say, stereo recording. And then from there, it becomes mastered. And what mastering used to mean is the process of cutting it into a lacquer disc. But now what it means is sort of taking that final mix, that stereo mix, and making it sound appropriate for its delivery. So in television, it might, you know, sound a little bit different than it would for iTunes, Spotify, and so forth. So when it comes to that final product, David, you were mentioning like, well, how do you prepare that in such a way that it's useful for a mastering engineer? The biggest thing that people tend to do is just slam the level like crazy, such that there's no quiet part, there's no loud part, it's all really smashed. And when there's so little difference between the loud and the soft, that means there's a very small dynamic range. And there's not a lot you can do with that in mastering. So Aaron mentioned keep your levels low, you know, keep a lot of headroom in there. And hopefully that translates to you having a better dynamic range. You can compress it later if you want to make it louder, but you can't really expand it from that really like compressed zone because so much information gets lost.
Right. And as you mentioned, Tom, like with EQing and cutting more than boosting, that has a lot to do with separating things out to where they fit the best in the frequency range before setting up for mastering and in the mixing process. And Chris Meyer, Learning Modular, just posted in the chat, and it like that was exactly like what I was going to say is like each instrument kind of has its own set of frequencies. And for me, like the biggest thing that I have learned is less is more. And what I've been learning is less is more in terms of how many instruments I use. One of the biggest things that I screwed up when I first got started, especially with multi-tracking, is because I would put so many tracks on top of each other because I thought it was just like, it was fun. It was really fun to add one more track. And before I knew it, I had 4 guitar parts, and all of my guitar parts are in the same frequency range and things like that. So that's when you start building up those spots that can be called mud or perceived as just resonant. And so with modular, one of the reasons that modular is so cool is that a lot of times all your voices have different filters on them and things like that. So you can be doing that mixing in your performance and kind of separating out the different voices a little bit to be getting just to make your performance sound a little bit more better as a whole before you start even recording. And I think that like with EQing and things like that, that has a lot to do with just cutting something out where something else shines. So like the bass guitar or the bass part in general, I used to always want to make them super squelchy. And squelchy bass parts work really well, but when you have mid-range pads and all this other stuff in the mid-range, well, that squelch is going to be in there as well. And so that it doesn't really fit as much. And I've learned that I can make my bass tone like a half or 25% as resonant as I thought it should be in the beginning when I was listening to it by itself, because it'll fit just so much better that way when it's not trying to take up so much of that mid-range sound.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think kind of what Alex is touching on there is it's a creative decision, but taking into mind the frequency spectrum. And so it's maybe it's easy, it depends upon the artist, but maybe you might find that a lot of your voices are kind of piling up in the mid-range. And maybe you don't realize that, but all of a sudden you kind of listen back and you're maybe listening to your music compared to somebody else's, and you're noticing that, well, how come, I mean, so-and-so has, you know, I can just hear more in the highs and mine's just kind of more muddy, and what's going on? And maybe it's an EQ thing, and it could be an EQ. And back to the EQ, like I always say, you cut EQ to fix a problem, and you boost EQ to enhance something. And I always try to cut first to try to fix any problem. But from the creative side of things, it's great to be able to like think about it like, well, I already have something in the low mids, and I have something in the bass, and I have something kind of high mids, but what can I do creatively? What voice can I introduce? What sound can I introduce that's in the higher frequency, that's there where there's nothing there? It's a wide open space up there. And high frequency, I mean, we can talk frequency numbers too, but I mean, forget that for a second and just say like, what can be up there kind of more in the shimmery range? What can I create that can be placed up there? Because currently there's nothing up there. And for myself in my modular rig, I love the octave switch. So it has 3 ranges, and it's like, okay, that sounds okay, but I think I already got that down there. And I just, with a flip of a button, it's like, okay, now it's up in a higher octave. Okay, that sounds cool, but I got one more range. Like, okay, well, that maybe sits better because now it's in a higher octave. You may need to adjust your filter a little bit now, but at least you might, by just with a flip of a button, creatively speaking, you've put a voice now in a higher range where there currently is no other voice. And back to the earlier comment, I think Tom mentioned about an RTA. I mean, I don't know. I don't really suggest. I know that I don't do this when I'm performing or writing a patch, for example. But it is possible to look at an RTA and kind of have that instant feedback of looking on RTA is a real-time analyzer, real-time analyzer showing you the frequency spectrum of what sounds are being produced, and you can see in a moment's notice where there's a buildup of frequencies or there's maybe no frequencies at all. And that can be something from a more technical standpoint of like, okay, quick objective glance from a technical standpoint, where are things frequency wise? And if you see a whole bunch of vacant frequencies up in the, above 5K or 3K, for example, or 10K even, then you can think, okay, well, maybe I can put something up there. That's an aspect of my creative process that I do think about spreading out voices across the frequency spectrum, and I find it really satisfying to think of it that way. And also, usually, it ends up to yield a result that's satisfying.
I think from a practical standpoint, it sounds kind of boring, but like we all practice our instrument, we all practice our patches. You kind of have to practice recording.
Absolutely.
Like treat it like spot drills. Doing the same thing over and over again until you find that sweet spot, and then eventually you get to the point where you can kind of predict what your settings are going to need to be and be surprisingly accurate with it over time. Right. But to get to that place, you have to record a bunch of stuff that sounds terrible first, right? Like just gross muddiness until you figure out how to clean it up and get a good quality product more quickly.
Absolutely. I think that the amount of times you can go from start to finish, just like all the way through, the more times you do that, the better you'll get at every single aspect. And that's something I've been doing a lot recently, is just like everything I start, I try to finish, because I could probably finish it quicker than I think that I can. And like, I've been in this doing it for a long time. I'm so over listening to the same thing for like months at a time. Yeah. So now it's like, no, I just get something done in 1 or 2 days and try and just push through, and every time I do that, and every time I'm able to like say something's 90% done, and if I really want to finish it, I can like take those extra steps, I get better and better at the steps. The finishing steps become easier because I'm getting better at the steps that are going into the beginning, as well as getting better at the steps at the end. And I think you're totally right. Like, practicing and repetition of all of it is a big deal, and just setting up the recorder multiple times and all that stuff.
Yeah. And I think there's one other step that we haven't talked about really, is like arrangement. I feel like that links the recording process and the mixing process.
That's what I was trying to get into. Yeah.
And like the ability to self-edit or record something and put it away for a while and then come back to it. And you might be surprised what you think of it. Like, you might think it's not good anymore, or the opposite, you think it's great. And that can really help clean up your ears, like ear cleaning, not literal ear cleaning, but like it can clear out the way that you're hearing those songs in a different way and make the mixing process a lot smoother.
Somebody, kind of based on the hearing thing, a couple people were asking about like the space analyzing software, like that ARC that IK Multimedia makes, or these different softwares that like kind of what do you call this? Like, they analyze your room and then tell you like where you need to make adjustments, and then they adjust your monitors like for your room. The whole idea is just that you want to hear things as accurately as they are. And if you're listening in a space that isn't necessarily perfectly treated or something, it's not exactly how it sounds, because you're getting like, maybe it's boomy, maybe you have something with your floor is reflecting a frequency that you're not realizing is happening. So when you do the car test or when you listen somewhere else, it sounds totally different. Why is that useful? It's like, yes, you could do the car test, but then every time you go back to your space to mix it, it's like fixing it with your ears covered. You're not really hearing what you need to be hearing. I'm not sure, about that stuff. Like, I haven't used it well, but I did pick up these. I'm curious if anyone's used these, this like VSX thing from Slate. I picked them up, and it's helping with the pandemic. Like, I have a shared recording studio, so it's helping to have somewhere to work when I don't want to be in there right after someone else. I don't know. I think I think they're pretty rad so far. I don't know. You just have to get familiar with your listening source. So right now I'm really just listening to a lot of music on these and trying to figure out, you know, getting familiar with that. So if you're listening to a song that you want to emulate constantly in your space and you're really familiar with your system, you don't necessarily need to correct it. But if you're finding that your mixes just are not translating regardless of where you're listening or regardless of where you're bringing them to, maybe something like that would be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, a technique that I would suggest, you know, a lot of the rooms that we're probably recording in are not ideal, right? And the reasons for that are like the shape of the room, the volume of the room, and all of the geometry of this affects how your speakers work in the room. So with untreated rooms, it's possible to have spaces where there's bass cancellation or even bass reinforcement. The treatment of rooms is all about correcting that. Like Rosanna said, you want to have the most accurate depiction of the frequencies as possible. One interesting way to test your room is to get in the sweet spot, and that's, you know, ideally you've got your speakers in a isosceles triangle. You know, the two speakers are pointing at you or a little bit out, the exact same distance, same height, and you want to minimize the hard surfaces that can reflect sound between the speakers and the ears. And that includes your walls, that includes, you know, maybe a monitor that could occlude the speaker, you know, between the speaker and your ears. But anyway, a good technique, one, or a couple I'll throw out there. One, play some music, maybe it's your own music, and get up and listen at different spaces in your room, right? Like the sweet spot may actually have some bass cancellation. You know, you'll be able to tell. And if you have the opportunity to use things like bass traps, then those can really improve the sound of your room and make it more accurate. Another thing to try is to play a sine wave dead pan center at different frequencies and listen closely to see if it sounds different in your two ears. And if it does, that tells you that your room has some asymmetry. So those are, you know, some techniques to help you really learn your environment. You know, in my opinion, those analysis tools, you know, Genelec has something too. I've not used them, but I believe they're meant more for flattening out a room response, but not in like major ways. You know, if you've got like a bass issue in your room, the analysis software is not going to fix that. You know, it's just too much physics that, you know, can't handle it.
Yeah, I think it's the idea, right, is that it fixes it in the speaker to try to account for the lack of your tuned room. For maybe I'm a little bit too organic or something, but that I don't use that software stuff either. It's a little bit hocus pocusy for me, but that's just me. And most importantly, what Rosanna was saying, like if your mixes are translating well, then you're doing great, and there's no need to. And if you're using that software and your mixes are translating, then you're doing great, and keep on using it. But if there is translation issues, then yeah, what we've already talked about, and also I think reference recordings in your space, like referencing a track or mini tracks that you like the sound of, and you're familiar with how that track sounds in many different spaces, car, headphones, your studio monitors, for example, and then start twiddling the EQ knobs to try to figure out how to reference or how to create your mix to be a little bit more similar to that. And then two, there's back to the RTA point. There is RTAs that you can import you can analyze the reference mix, and then it'll chart out the RTA EQ curve, and then it'll bring in yours, and you can see it overlap to each other and see where in real time where things are what's lacking or what's different about it. And with that, I think definitely mixing on more than one source of speakers. So don't just mix on headphones, reference both headphones and studio monitors, like in real time, like so you can go back and forth. And I would also add this for headphones, is that if you're mixing, then using headphones that are open back headphones, those are much more natural sounding. I'm sorry, and I'm not familiar with the Slate headphones, Rosanna, so you have to tell me about that. Mm-hmm. But for more traditional headphones, open back headphones are much more accurate in my opinion. And also headphones, then close-back headphones that you would use if you were tracking in a studio space, an acoustic instrument that has a close-back headphone. And then with that too, if say your studio setup is that you have monitors but you don't have a sub, totally understandable. Then it may be, in my opinion, the best way to, in that setup, the best way to reference your bass is probably going to be on headphones. Now that says not to mix the entire thing on headphones, but if all of a sudden you're working on your bass frequencies and you want to get a better glimpse down low, and you just know because you don't have a sub in your room, your headphones are going to be your probably better friend to take a peek down in those lower frequencies. But then make sure and go back and forth. And if your mix is translating from your speakers, your monitors to your headphones fairly accurately, then you're on the good first two steps, I would say, for your mix to translate to other systems as well.
Yeah, someone previously made a point about fatigue, listening fatigue. It's a physical phenomenon. Your ears do get tired. So, it's useful to take an auditory break. And also, I use a sound pressure level meter in my studio to make sure I don't really crank up the volume. Because, but I do it, it's fun when something sounds really good to start saying, yeah, I want to listen to this a little louder. It's really easy for that to accumulate over time. And all of a sudden you get to these sound pressure levels that are really kind of, first of all, your ears don't really hear the same way when it's super loud. So I use one of these things.
I just leaned over I could see in this room.
Yeah, this thing I'll turn on when I'm mixing from time to time, just to make sure that I'm not really listening too loud. What's that?
Can you hold it up again so we can see?
Oh yeah.
Okay. So
this is a sound pressure level meter, and I typically like to keep it around under 60 decibels when I'm mixing. That's just a good, comfortable volume, and you'll probably find that you can mix longer and better at lower volumes. So
yeah, one of the big things, so just to speak to fatigue, that's something that I wanted to mention about arrangement is cutting. Mid-range stuff will give you lots of fatigue, and it will give your listeners lots of fatigue. So that's kind of a cool thing about arrangement, is just kind of making sure you're giving breaks in all of the different frequency ranges as you go. In that, just so you know where you're at. But another thing about what you just said, Tom, is your room, the problems of your room are also going to be amplified the louder that you mix at, the louder that you're listening at. And so that's another thing to remember is if you don't have the best space, listening at a quieter volume lets you hear the speakers without them bouncing off the walls as much as when you're just blasting it, where you're going to hear the bass really building up and creating a lot of energy.
Yeah, Build on the chat asks about open back headphones, and I use AKGs. I'm wearing AKGs right now. They make some headphones called K240S that are great. They're they sound good. They're open back. They're $70. Really good value, and I would recommend those pretty highly.
Those are my first pair of open back, was an AKG, and in that price range that he has flashed up, I'm a fan in that price range of the Grados. I can't remember the model name, but there's a Grado makes an open back headphone in that price range too. That's really nice.
Cool. Yeah, I was gonna say just bump it up $50, and the K702s are awesome. That's what I have, and I go back and forth on those a lot. And Biodynamic has some open back ones. I have Biodynamic closed backs that I reference on a lot that I think are good for a reference. Definitely, I can't wear them for longer than 30 minutes because they hurt my ears, but they're definitely they're a really good reference.
And one other quick thing about the sound pressure meter, which I love that you brought that out, Tom, is that when you're referencing mixes to your track to somebody else's track, you have to match the levels, because otherwise 10 times out of 10 the louder source is going to be perceived as the better sounding source, and that's not true at all. So what I use my sound pressure meter level for, in addition to what Tom mentioned, to make sure I'm not monitoring too loud for too long, because over hours it's easy to just keep on cranking up that volume, is referencing is matching the volume between any reference recordings that I'm referencing. And in my setup, it's just like a button back and forth between the reference and my track I'm working on. So both for safety by monitoring your volume, and also just the other useful function of that is making sure that you're monitoring or you're referencing in the same ballpark volume-wise between your track that you're working on and the reference track. Yeah,
another thing about referencing, I've been just like laziness makes me just want to be able to just hit Spotify, press play, and then go back and forth. And it's like download the track, put it in the program, and be able to reference it back and forth that way. Because like you said, then you can pull up an RTA if you want to, things like that. You have more control over that. But at the same time, it's so much easier to balance levels when it's all in one spot than it is to like go between programs. And I won't talk about what Spotify does to your music because I don't know, but I imagine that there's some things in there that makes it not as accurate as just taking the wave and putting it in your DAW.
Yeah. So about the reference recording. So we use a reference recording, like a released recording from mixing. Now that recording has been mastered.
Correct.
Right. So what do you recommend? Do you just you said analyze the volume or to make them similar, but do you just drop it a few decibels to kind of align that, or is there anything else that you would recommend doing to a released recording to really make it a proper reference recording? Ideally, you would have the mixed recording without the master, which is often not possible.
In my opinion, if you can mix a track well enough that the mastering, the least the work the mastering engineer has to do, the better the mix to a certain extent. I mean, the mastering engineer is still going to limit it and make it competitive, make it loud and enter metadata and all that kind of stuff. But referencing a master release track to your mix, it's apples and apples in my book. It's just you just have to lower the volume so that they're the same volume range. I don't hesitate at all to reference a master track to a mix that I'm working on, because you want it to sound. I mean, if your mix sounds that good to begin with, or at the end of the mix, then great. I mean, you're doing a good job.
So I have a question, kind of on this, but also kind of going back a little bit. One thing that I always had trouble with is all of that sounds great, like the frequency stuff. I feel like I get more comfortable with that when I'm doing my ambient stuff. But as soon as I add drums, I feel like it all hell breaks loose. Like, what's going on? So I'm specifically talking about electronic drums, not necessarily doesn't have to actually be modular drums. Because I know some people also use other rigs in their modular or outside their modular. But so for electronic drums, which I guess even the sampled ones would somehow still be mixed well, I guess. But when you put them all together, that's when I feel like I'm like, oh, what's going on? How do I handle this? So, any advice for that area? Rosanna, can you answer? Because I think you're a drummer, right?
I am, as evidenced by the cymbals right behind me. Yeah. But I'm a drummer, and I usually use sample drums. I use like an SPD and old Simmons sampler pads and stuff live, which are fun. But my recommendation is using compression as like a creative tool, like using specifically parallel compression. If you have like a kick that's 4 on the floor consistently throughout your song and some pads accompanying it throughout the entire song, those things are going to really compete with one another. But if you use parallel compression, what it's doing is it's kind of lowering the kick drum like at every beat, or lowering the synthesizer, rather, whatever your pads are, whatever it is that's competing with the kick. You can apply compression to it, parallel compression to it. This is just something, like, Google it later. We can't get it like super into it right now, but like research parallel compression. Most plugins that come with software, like the basic Dyne 3 whatever compressor that comes with Pro Tools, if you use that, they all have like a little key thing on the top. You can click that. And
we were talking about sidechaining, right?
Yes, sidechain.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's going to really help a lot with getting your drums to have presence without squashing everything else. Yeah, and just tinkering, like just tinker, explore that idea and that concept, and put it on different things and see how it affects your mix.
Yeah, yeah, and the reason why side chaining works is that it's using the machines to automatically make space to separate those parts from each other. So when the kick hits, the sidechain compression is going to lower the level of whatever else is passing through it. So that inherently just makes more room for your kick to shine in the mix. In my opinion, a lot of electronic drums are really big. You know, like it's you know, you go to look at your kick drums, and if you were to look at that on a spectrum analyzer, you'll see that the bass is like, it's full and it's big and it's huge. And also a lot of modular performances tend to mix everything either in the modular or, you know, mix the drums together without, say, carving a lot of bass out. So it also happens with big snare drums or big, you know, big hi-hats. You know, cymbals and hi-hats, because they use noise, actually occupy quite a bit of the harmonic spectrum, because it's pretty much all the frequencies within that notch are being used by snares and hi-hats. So it just leaves less room for other elements in your mix. So you look at carving EQ out, look at sidechain compression. I mean, in some cases you want that. You know, if you want a big kind of techno booming sound, you want that. But it still is important to kind of carve out, you know, where you want those things to be. So yeah, more EQ modules.
Yeah, EQ everything. EQ everything. You know, then deal with the side chaining.
Yeah, it can also, I mean, just also in arrangement too. I mean, one of a big lessons I had earlier was someone said, yeah, why are dubstep snares so big? And it's because they don't let anything else play when the snare hits. And it's like, I started listening to a little bit of dubstep and I was like, holy shit, he's so right. Like, they literally suck everything out, whether it's with sidechain or just by arrangement. A lot of times they'll just take everything out when the snare hits, and it just makes the snare hit so big. And one of the things about that is you think about like limiters and how much space you have to occupy from, you know, mute to the unity level. And when you have all that and you have so many things competing for space, it's going to be a lot harder to hear something punch through. But when you have all that, you take it all away and the snare comes through in the middle, that's how that drum's going to sound just giant. And that's how a lot of those things work.
In a way, it's kind of fun to think about sidechaining as a form of modulation, because it's the act of, for example, in Alex's example, the snare is being hit, which is then triggering a compressor on whatever instrument, other instruments, maybe it's the rest of the mix, to be compressed down every time that snare is hit. So in a way, I look at that as kind of like it's sort of a form of modulation, or automation, I guess, in the engineering world, but it's kind of fun to think about it as modulation. Totally.
And you can patch up sidechain compression using an envelope follower and invert that, you know, into your VCA, right? Put an attenuator on it so you can control how much of that inverted envelope goes there. But say if your kick goes through an envelope follower, you know, you're going to get the envelope of that kick coming out. Like I said, invert it and add that to the VCA on whatever else you want to duck.
Yep.
Cool.
Yeah, and if you don't have an envelope follower, just use the trigger that's doing that and use another envelope.
There you go.
Yeah. Well, I think it's important to remember the difference between actual loudness and perceived loudness, whether it's with kick drum or anything else. I was thinking specifically of like explosions in movies. They're never actually very loud in the sound, but it has that impact, right? Because that initial transient or impulse of the noise is quite loud, and then everything else gets sucked out. And then your brain is like, oh, that was a loud noise, right? Whereas in reality, it's actually not all that loud. And that can help keep things from getting too cluttered with drums.
Right. You mean like they take any ambient noise that was going on and any conversations or anything like that, that all goes away. So the only thing you hear is the explosion.
Right. Like the snare, the dub snare example, right? Because then it's playing with the psychology of how our brain processes information, as opposed to like my kick drum's just not loud enough. I need to boost it. I'm like, well,
Yeah.
no, there are other ways that you can get that result in the listener's ears than just turning it up louder, you know?
Absolutely. I think that's a really cool way to talk about it, because that's something I didn't even think about. And yeah, in movie sound, it's like that makes so much sense. If everything else disappears and that's the only thing you're going to hear, you're going to perceive that as loud.
Because if it was actually as loud relative to the dialogue as it would need to be, like everybody would have hearing damage, right?
And they'd be buying new speakers at every
right. They get
show.
lawsuits and all kinds of,
Yeah, but Grant, you're touching on something really important, which is, you know, our perception system for our auditory perception system in our brains. It's really good at filling in missing information. So, you know, an example of this is, you know, take a saw wave and run it through a high pass filter. All right. So the first frequency in that whole, you know, harmonic series is going to be the fundamental. But when you start high passing that saw wave, the pitch doesn't change, right? You can filter out that fundamental frequency, so it's gone. But the pitch, your brain actually fills in what that pitch really is. So it supplies the fundamental. So to apply that concept to, say, kick drums, well, your kick drum is going to be really big in the low end, and you can actually start cutting that low end without changing the pitch of the drum and without changing its perceived impact. You know, the woofers are probably going to, you know, not pump as hard, but it still can sound the same. And one of the first tips that I got about kick drum mixing that I initially thought that's stupid was boost truly was boost the mid. If you boost the mid, the pop of that kick drum, and I'm talking about like maybe around 1,000 hertz or so, play with it.
Yeah.
That's going to be the click, like the transient of the kick drum, and you can actually roll off some of that bass if you want to make room for a signed bass line, for example.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, and just to, I mixing drums, I definitely high pass kick. I mean, 20 hertz, 25 hertz, like that stuff. In my opinion, I have to get rid of that in order to clear up the kick to make it, like you're talking about, stand out and actually be like a transient that can be understood versus versus kind of like a blob, a sonic low end blob.
Low end blob. Yeah, that's not good.
Yeah, and in like studying too, just like studying tracks I was listening to, it's like there are certain songs where I learned that the bass lives in the kick, and they let the sub frequencies below 80 to like 40 really shine there, and then the bass line is, if there is one, because the kick, a lot of times when the kick's that big and like a really long release, you're not going to have room for a bass line. You could just do everything else a little bit higher. But if there is a bass line, it kind of lives a little bit higher than that sub frequency. And then on the other side of things, like I was like obsessed with, you know, funk music and disco music, and it's like the bass lives way lower than the kick in all that music, and the kick is just keeping the time. And like you said, that's in the click, and it's not as important that it thumps. But then when you hear it on a big system, you still get the thump because it is there. It's just not as loud as it is in like the bass guitar, for instance.
Totally. Or I mean, another arrangement tip is combine the bass and your kick together, right? So you can create a kick drum that has a pitch, and you know, if you're writing a song, for example, that depends on chord changes, or you know, you've got some kind of chord progression, tune your kick drum to follow that progression, because then the fundamental of that kick drum isn't going to compete with a different fundamental of, say, your bass or your chord. So that's an arrangement technique, but that really consolidates all the bass down to one part.
That's interesting. I use a bass module, the PIA, so I could follow that. I wonder how that. I mean, I know there are ways of doing it, but some of the samplers, like a Tip Top 1 or something, following the pitch on the kick, that's what you're using, would be definitely a bit challenging.
Yeah, well, if you're using, say you've got a sequence going on an analog sequencer, and you use a key step, you know, or some other 1 volt per octave to change the pitch of that sequence around, you can take the 1 volt per octave into a buffered mult, and then use that same pitch on the CV 1 volt per octave input on your bass module if it supports that. So there you go. It's just built in, and you press the same keys, and so it'll follow it around.
Yeah, and you're using the same information of the sequencer of the thing you're using to transpose the main sequence, which is running a little bit faster. Yeah, that makes sense. I tend to like I've tried that a lot, and I tend, at least just like for the style of music that I make, that the kick drum actually sounds a lot of times sounds better if it's not like the fundamental of the whole track, because then it stands out. So just a word real quick to everybody who's watching this, everything we say is also just like what's best for the song. Take it with a grain of salt, right?
Yeah.
Everything is what, like, at the end of the day, it is like you listening to the track and trying to make adjustments to make decisions that are best for the track. And that's what's so funny, is like it's something that you're creating, so it's something that doesn't exist yet. But as soon as you hear the first thing that you make, like, okay, this is going in this kind of direction. And then it's all decisions based on like reactions to what has happened as you're doing it. And so it's like, like nothing is do this every single time, right? It's like, yeah, try it, see what happens, because it could be totally the right move. And that's what this is all about, is experimenting and having a good time.
Absolutely.
Well, speaking of good times, let's take a little break here real quick to have a good time. We're gonna take a small break and let heckseven jump in here and do a quick performance. I should let him know he's up.
Yeah.
Hey, heckseven, yeah. We're gonna take a listen to this, so we're gonna check out heckseven's set, and then we'll be back and we'll talk a little bit. I have one more question about mixing, and then we'll get into mastering. So stick around and check out heckseven's mix, everybody. heckseven, are you ready? And let me add to the screen. Pretty good. All right. There we go. All right. Everybody, heckseven.
I've got to click unmute on too many things. All right, let's do this for real this time. Yeah, too much EQ. So this is a lesson in how to not do EQ properly. I thought maybe I should do as many oscillators at the same time that I own with zero EQ. So think of this as the before picture, and then a few shows later I'll come back and you'll see what proper EQ sounds like.
That was dope.
How was that?
That was good.
So dope. Way to go.
Awesome.
Right now, so give me a second.
That's awesome. Oh, that's cool. Yeah. Whoa. Let's just talk about that patch real quick before we dive into the rest of the show. So that was heckseven. Heckseven, what part of Colorado are you in? Where are you?
All right, I can now officially hear you again. Sorry about that.
Okay. Okay.
One set of headphones.
No, it's so weird. I always hear you in that cool microphone.
Yeah, Granby.
Granby. Awesome.
8,000 feet. That's why I'm drinking so much. I'm not. It's not a lot of air up here.
No, so you gotta fill it with liquid. I get it. It's all good. That's right. So real quick, can I tell us a little bit about that patch, if you can?
Okay. Yeah.
I'm gonna...
Jeez. Well, are there any parts you want to hear about? I mean, I'm particularly fond of this weird voice, which is like the grossest filter. Wait, no, not that one. This one.
That's cool.
So that's like a weird GUR filter that's not like a standard low pass or anything. It's this weird look mum no computer filter thing that I don't remember how it works.
So that rack there, the top part you were just playing with, that's all DIY stuff, right?
Everything you see is everything you see is DIY except for the Eurorack modules right here.
Wow.
This little section.
Yeah, and you have a telephone in there too, like a dial, don't you? I remember seeing that.
Yeah, I do.
That is awesome.
Yeah.
It's pretty rad. It's a stutter, and right now it's connected to, I think, this voice.
Yeah, that's fun. That's fun for days. But you have a lot of different gear. You also have looks like maybe you have some drums. Well, what are you using for drums over there?
Almost all of my drums are drum root impact, with the exception of when I occasionally break out like a vocal sample or use the Rample module. Rample module is my go-to for like breakbeat stuff.
That's cool. That's awesome. So, my question for you related to the show is, what's your signal flow for recording and for mixing for one? You have so many different sources. What's your current solution?
Yeah, I'm using a few things cleverly. There are two mixer modules in these two cases that are quad VCA mixers. Those handle most of the audio that comes out of that goes through here, except for maybe the morphogene when I want like a stereo signal out. Everything else goes into the mixer over there, which is a Zoom L12. And that thing's a little monster. I love it. Its audio into the computer and out of the computer is ridiculously cool, and works. Like I can go 14 channels out of it at the same time into like Ableton or whatever I'm recording in, or I can record on the mixer, which is what I usually do because I'm just lazier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's awesome.
And so is the Squarp pyramid your main? Everything comes there, or like how are you using that?
Yeah, the Squarp pyramid does most of the things. Sometimes I'll use internal sequencers on the device, depending on what I need. Like the Microfreak has some fun stuff with the sequencer, so sometimes I'll use that one. But the clock and everything else comes out of the pyramid, including like I think the only CV out from it is a gate signal going to my compressor pedal. So I can control when that compressor hits rather than every single kick drum or something.
It's a little side chaining there.
Yeah. Didn't do much of it on this one. There's a little bit, but.
Well, that was
sounded awesome.
Yeah, it's really awesome. We're going to have heckseven wrap up the show at the end, so stick around for more. And but before we do that, just in case, heckseven, do you have a YouTube channel? Are you putting out any albums right now? Or?
No, but I do have a YouTube channel. Yeah, definitely go there and subscribe and comment, whatever. Give me EQ tips.
That's all you're gonna get. I won't tell you if I like it or not, but let me give you a few pointers, kid.
There's too many things in the 60 kilohertz range, you know.
Keep paying attention to the show, and maybe we'll get you to record something to put out, for sure. Okay. Thanks, man. We'll put you back in the green room and have you back on the end of the show. Thanks. That was awesome, Brad. Oh, I love it. So cool. So before we broke, we were talking a little bit about we were wrapping up some stuff about mixing and recording and stuff like that. I just had a couple questions real quick in my head. So when we were talking about drums, it made me think about the importance of submixing, and I want to know what you all have some advice for like doing submixes. And I was thinking of drums, but I'm sure that applies to other things. So anybody want to talk about submixing?
Oh, what do you want to know? I mean, it's a small mix.
Yeah, I think where I was hoping to go is that I think some people are really aware of that. I think when you start off a set, I mean, obviously, like I think not obviously, but a lot of people, I see their setups, and like the last thing they have is like an output module, and they're just slamming everything into that output module, and especially when it's like drums and everything like that. I got the performance mixer, and it like totally changed. Yeah, it changed a few things for me. Besides, you know, breaking it out, but it also like helped me with arrangement. And now, I have a multi-track recorder, and I submix all my drums in my the performance mixer when I'm not playing out live. That's something that like didn't dawn on me until like I started listening to those recordings with everything slammed together, like trying to do stereo recordings with drums. And I just thought that like there's something to it that I think that maybe people might want to consider looking at getting other mixing modules in their signal flow before the output, the final output.
Yeah, well, I can talk about a little bit, at least how I think about submixing, and the way I think about it is it's a technique to use in a few situations. One situation is when you want to be able to control a set of voices or instruments together and not alter their volumes, right? You not alter their relative gain. So drums are a good example, or maybe you've got, say, I don't know, in quadraphonics, maybe you've got like a layered big swooshy thing that's comprised of several voices. You want to be able to bring it in and out, but you don't want, to move 4 faders or whatever it is. So submixing there is just a technique to use a mixer to give you one, after you submix, you come out into like either a mono or stereo or whatever channel, and then you've got one fader on it, right? So that's a convenience method. Or you submix, like you're saying, David, to go into your interface, perhaps, to have one mix. The other reason I do it is when I want to use effects on that submix in a way that maybe glues them all together. So a good example is drums. Rosanna, by the way, had to take off. She's not with the panel anymore, but she was mentioning how parallel compression and sidechaining in drums can become like a creative technique to give you more punch or more action or whatever. So, submixing is frequently done on drums together, and parallel compression is one of the reasons for that. And what we mean by parallel compression is that instead of the entire submix of, say you've got a kick, snare, hi-hat, whatever, and it's all mixed together into one stereo signal usually, parallel compression refers to the fact that you can put a compressor on that entire mix, but also bring in the uncompressed signal together. And it's kind of a deep subject, but if you start playing with that, I mean, some compressors will actually have a wet-dry knob, and if you put that in the middle, there you go. That's parallel compression. So yeah, some of the reasons to do that is like the compressors are going to add artifacts to the signal, and that's usually you want that unless you're mastering. We can talk about that in a bit, because that'll give the percussion like this movement to it, or smash it, or make it really creatively cool. But then you might want to bring in the uncompressed mix so that you get, say, more of your transient in there, more of that just less affected signal. So it's an interesting technique to use. So that's how I think about submixes. But I mean, in modular, if you're building up a voice of 2 or 3 oscillators, sending it through the same filter, well, guess what? You're submixing, right?
I would add to the parallel compression thought just by saying, typically when I parallel compress, I'm going to slam the compression side of things a lot harder, because I'm also going to bring in the complete dry uncompressed signal. So I'm compressing a lot harder than I would if it was just strapped, if it was not parallel compressing. And just also to add another element or another kind of axis to parallel compression, I think it's cool to use a multi-band compressor for your parallel compression, especially when looking at something that has such a wide frequency range as the drums, because drums themselves has low subharmonics to high shimmery sounds, and so the low frequencies are going to be the most powerful frequencies, and the low frequencies are going to be the ones that trigger the compressor first. And maybe you want that, maybe that's great, and maybe you don't want that because the kick is causing the compressor to compress the drums, and then the cymbals or like the higher frequencies are suffering from that. So with the parallel multi-band compressor, then you have control over the different frequency ranges and when different frequency ranges trigger compression, and you can possibly allow more of the kick to come through uncompressed before the compressor triggers. Therefore, then the higher frequencies aren't squashed as much. And also, with a lot of compressors nowadays have the side chain, or the what's the term? The filter, the low pass filter, or high pass filter, excuse me.
Yeah, on the detector.
Yeah. So that's going to do the same thing as it's going to allow the low frequencies. And every compressor has that set at a different frequency, or maybe some compressors have, you can adjust the frequency at which the high pass is going to allow, which frequencies are going to allow the compressor is going to allow to go through. And typically it's around 90 hertz, sometimes it's 70 hertz, but that's going to allow the predominant girth of your kick drum to go through uncompressed. This is not parallel compression, by the way. This is just a way to use another compressor that will not compress the compression won't be triggered by your kick drum. It'll be triggered more by the average volume of the source, the drums, for example, and not just by the most powerful frequency.
Yeah, I've been noticing that a lot, like when recording real drums and like an overhead, for example, where you want the cymbals to kind of have a real flat, brick wall to hit, and the kick drum can trigger it, and when you're not even hitting the cymbals and not let them ring out as much. Yeah, submixing for me is really interesting because I don't necessarily do it in the modular as much, but I know that like one of the reasons why you would want to do it is you have an 8-channel mixer that's your normal mixer, and you have like 14 voices. So, and when we talk about voices, we talk about like your kick drum's a voice, your snare's a voice. So your drums take up voices really quickly. So when you start using a mixer, a lot of times you can just run out of channels on like, the WMD mixer, for instance. So a lot of times people will submix before that. I personally use the channels expander and then try and figure out any way I can to get everything individually tracked out. And then where my submixes come in is when I'm actually mixing in the DAW. And that is a lot more about grouping instruments that are like-minded instruments together to create submixes. And then, as someone mentioned in the chat, like what are referred to as stems. So a lot of times people will call individual tracks stems, but that's not necessarily like the actual meaning of that word. A lot of times, like when you get stems for a remix, for instance, you're not going to get all 40 tracks in the composition. You're going to get the drums. You probably get a kick drum separate, then you're going to get the drums, and then you'll get all of the vocals together, all of the mid-range pads together, all of the different bass sounds together, and those are all different groups that will be bounced out together to create maybe anywhere between 4 and 8 group like stems that you can turn into your mix and use for your for remixes. But like what's nice about doing that is that now you're starting to think about things in groups of frequency ranges and as well as purposes in the track. And we keep talking about drums as being one of those big groups. One of the sub mixes I do in the DAW a lot is just like a subgroup. So I'll just have the kick and then I'll put the bass together. A lot of times it's just so I can solo them together really easily and make sure that they're not fighting each other. If they are fighting each other, the first thing I do before I start grabbing EQ or anything is just turn the bass down just to see if maybe I just needed the volume to go down a little bit so I could hear my kick a little bit more. But then I'll throw a limiter on that group. And then every time that kick hits, it brings everything down. And then as the bass comes up, you're going to hear the bass more. But I think submixing for me happens a lot more in the DAW than it actually happens in my system, which I would love for it to happen more in my system, but I'm out of room.
Yeah.
Well, especially with submixing with the function of processing things together, that's more challenging to do in a rack versus in a DAW. Yeah, exactly. And that was like another thing. It does become a little easier. So, like if you think about using a
a sampler for your drums, for instance, where now you can you have the option, like with the raw sum assimilator, you have the option to go all individual outs or a stereo mix out at the bottom. And now you can run that through a filter and or an EQ or a compressor or whatever, and just have that be your submix of your drums or not. It's kind of a decision. I choose to always have individual ones because I like having the fader control over each drum to mute it or, bring it in and out. But I think that just muting triggers is another way to arrange. So that's another way to do it for sure.
Here's a question from the chat. Do you want to use a high pass filter like the ShockMat before or after the compressor?
So just real quick, I'll just say the ShockMat, I think what the person's mentioning is it's just gonna cut out the subs, or it kind of it's like a fixed filter that just says everything below 120 doesn't come through to keep things out of the sub range.
My general approach to EQing and compression is that you want to, I EQ, corrective EQ first before compressing. And the reason behind that is I want to compress a better sounding source. And so I'm going to EQ, definitely subtractive EQ before I compress, so that it's kind of the same thing as earlier I said about you don't want the problematic frequencies to be poking out and triggering the compressor, and then you're going to have to kind of chase your tail by EQing it after the compressor. So,
yes, I agree, and especially. Oh, I'm sorry to cut you off here.
Oh, that's all right. Then I was going to say, then after the compression, this isn't a DAW, that is, mostly. Then after compression, I will add another EQ to enhance. So then now I'm enhancing, in theory, a better sounding signal source that has some compression applied to it.
Yeah, I was just going to say, especially if you're boosting in your EQ, it's nice to have the compressor after, just in case, especially for performance-oriented stuff, in case, you happen to catch some sibilance on a vocal or something like that. Your compressor, if it's after the EQ, can be there to dial that back so it's not so jarring. But yeah, when mixing, I agree with what Aaron's saying. I mean, these are all just creative techniques, I forget. I think maybe it was Alex who said this. These are we're sharing our bag of tricks. There's no one way to do everything. These are some things that have worked for us, but you learn a lot by experimenting, right? So
yeah, I'm gonna go after this. I'm gonna start doing it the other way because I always compress the signal. That's the first thing that I do. Is the signal comes, I record stuff, but as far as in the DAW, the first thing I do is compress the signals I'm working with, and then EQ afterwards. And the reason I do that is because I tend to make a lot of music that doesn't have tons of dynamic range. So I'm all about smashing it and then shaping that sound, shaping the smash sound. But it totally makes sense of I want to make it sound good and then compress it. So yeah, I mean, any way you do it, it's how you do it.
Yeah.
Well, and just to add something to, I'm a big fan EQ wise, there's all kinds of different types of EQs, and on the spectrum of more surgical EQs where you can really get in there and find problematic frequencies, the EQ that I use, not only does it have an RTA that you can see across the whole spectrum what the frequencies are doing, but also wherever you click and create a node for an EQ band, you can also solo that frequency, and then you can drag it around, and so then you can just really hear what that frequency sounds like. So it's just kind of good ear training to understand what 300 hertz sounds like compared to 900 hertz. But also you can adjust the Q, so you can be really narrow or broad, semi-broad or really broad, and then you can then say, okay, I hear you have the sound in your ears of the problem frequency that you're going for, and then you can solo that band and drag it around the EQ, and then you find it, and then at that point you cut it however many dBs, and then you bring it back, and then you can bypass the EQ and then engage it, and then see if you're making proper
progress
improvements. And that EQ, just to give it a name, it's a Fab Filter.
I knew it. Pro Q.
Q3, yeah, the Pro Q3. And that's also add another layer to that. And I'm not endorsed by these folks. I don't get any kickback at all, but it's just, this is how excited I am about this EQ. It's also, any band you create, you can also turn it into a dynamic band as well. So that right there is a form of multi-band compression to a certain extent, where let's say you're cutting a frequency, and then it's like, okay, that's pretty good, but man, there's those occasional times when that spikes, and I want to kind of get after that a little bit more. Then you can tell it to engage the dynamic aspect of that band, and then it'll, as that dynamic frequency comes up and gets a little bit too loud, then it'll push it back down. I'm a huge fan of that EQ.
Yeah, the like a trick of like when you're just like spiking a frequency is I always just sing the problem frequency I'm trying to match, and then sing it and move the notch until it hits the thing that I'm singing, because that helps me like know what it is. But yeah, I started using the multi-band compressor that has sidechain from FabFilter, and like that I am now like starting to like, why I'm so like about the arrangement is because I'm trying to make it that I don't need this tool, you know, just by thinking about it ahead of time. But it was so cool that they have a tool that just can take, you know, it can do sidechain compression as we're talking about, but only to one band. So talk about kick drum and bass lines not clashing. It's like if you have a bass sound playing at the same time as the kick, and they're in the same frequency range. Well, now you can just only take out the sub frequency of the bass line, and you'll still get the upper end of the frequency spectrum, such as like the squelch or whatever kind of character that's in the bass line that really defines it. You know, it's like the sub doesn't define the bass as much as like the mid range. So you can be cutting out that the lower end without cutting out the higher end, and that's like an amazing tool. The FabFilter stuff. Yeah, I played with the demos for a long time. I still haven't hit the buy button, but I've definitely exhausted the demos.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, if they're watching, we are totally open for sponsorships.
Yeah,
so
right.
But, so I want to ask you a question here because I'm definitely noobish on recording and stuff like that. Even though I'm the kind of person I record everything out of my modular. I'm now multi-tracking recording, but before it was a stereo pairs, and I would send it to somebody like Grant and say, make it louder. Make it. I don't know. Like, so I want to know, like, when you started to talk about getting in there and getting surgical with the EQs and doing this work here, are we still in mixing, or are we now getting into mastering? When do I start to? When's one thing become the other?
I mean, those tools can be applied in both stages. You know, mixing, like we covered a little bit before, maybe I think it's the process, at least for me, mixing is producing that final 2-track or whatever, maybe it's 5.1 or quadraphonic recording, right? And if you're recording directly to stereo, you're mixing as you perform, right? You're controlling levels, you're controlling your EQ, you're looking at your gain staging. With multi-tracking, there's a trade-off, right? And multi-tracking means you either at the same time perform and capture all tracks of your voices separately, or maybe submixes, or you can do it asynchronously where you record one and then the next and then the next. The trade-off is you get much more power to create much better sounding and sometimes more creative mixes at the expense of spending a lot more time on it, right?
Sorry.
So I was just going to say, so, you know, when we talk about like carving out all the subs from a bass, or spending time to, you know, make sure your bass and your kick drums don't collide, all that stuff. At least for me, like I do multi-track recording almost all the time. So for me, that's where it's applied. You don't want to be cutting off all your bass, right? And in the final mastering stage. But these tools and techniques can be applied. Like Aaron was talking about dynamic EQ, where maybe you've got like some sibilance that comes up, or that one, you know, bass hit that came in too loud. You can carve that out only at that time using that tool, whether it's in the track or whether it's in the finished part.
Or if it's a rings voice that pops out too hard.
Yeah. I think another thing, like another trade-off is the the original energy that you have and how long you're able to keep that fire going. So like I watched some interview with Surgeon, a techno producer recently, and he does everything stereo recordings. And he's just like, I spend a ton of time mixing before I mixing and getting all of my my parts to sound right before I do the final performance. And then I do the final performance, and it's probably like 4 or 5 instruments, a drum machine and 3 or 4 instruments. And then he might add 1 or 2 on top of that. And then that's the finished product, like asynchronously, like you said, Tom. But like his kick drum and bass line, most of the times are going to be printed from the beginning. And I find that super interesting of like what he is trying to make sure he does is capture the energy of the recording at the time and of the performance at the time he makes it. And he's like fired up about it when he's making it. And so he makes sure to capture all that energy. And when you multi-track something, you can be really excited about something. And then you can just whittle away at it for a long time, trying to get every piece right. And that fire can start to just like die down, and you can start to just get less and less excited about the project. And then, maybe a month later, you're still working on the same track. It could even just be 4 hours later, you're still working on the same track and you're just kind of burnt out on it. So there's that like trade-off between like being, in the moment, capturing everything, and then versus like really trying to hone in on all the details. And I think that that's something that like is just a personal balance that everyone kind of has to learn and deal with, I guess. I don't know why I'm saying this. It's just like, it's a big thing.
Well, it's also possible to get, like a mix engineer to mix it for you.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Like you can do your rough mix and say, and this is where stems come in, right? If you've got, some people use like 80 different tracks in your recording. Well, if you give that to a mix engineer, it's going to be pretty difficult to dig through it and just kind of put all that information into his or her brain. If you mix those down to say 8 stems, then you've got the parts that you believe are the kind of the primary parts of your track. And then the mix engineer, well, that person's role is to go in and say, let's make this sound as good as it can. Sometimes there's creative stuff with adding effects and automation of certain volume or pan, but absolutely. I just wanted to throw that out. Like you could get somebody else to mix it for you.
Right. Yeah. And that's I have absolutely done that. And it has worked wonders.
Yeah, no, that's something I'm testing out right now. Working with somebody who has experience working with stems and experience working in that environment to help me kind of walk through that and actually just have someone to bounce it off of, because that's one thing I really enjoy, like talking to you all and talking to anybody when they're working on my music or personally, is to get that feedback. And people will say, well, it's your artistic stuff, and I that's totally true, but sometimes you have to hear that, right? Like I can't make that artistic decision whether you want that. I could, but there's a lot of tools there. So it's really good stuff. Before we go, one more question before we go into mastering about recording. It's about quadraphonic recording. And I was wondering if someone wants to get into that. I think Frank might be in the chat too. I know he does a lot of that as well. But
yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. The other co-founder of Patchwork, Cindy Reichel, and I sometimes perform together in quad, and it's really interesting because the whole tool chain is different. If you go look at most mixers on the market, especially ones that are inexpensive, they're stereo mixers, right? However, many mixers are multi-bus, right? So you can have a 4 or 8 bus mixer, and that's where you can use a bus for each of the 4 channels of quadraphonic sound. Then think about panning, right? So if you want to be able to pan across those 4 channels, well, it gets difficult just because pan is usually stereo left, right. So, you can bring that stuff into the computer. Ableton Live has got some great Max for Live stuff for quad or, surround panning, that kind of stuff. So it does take some thought, and also it just doubles the expense of your monitoring and your channel count and all that stuff. But, you can do some really creative stuff with it. And one thing that we found was we were thinking, well, we really want the audience to be in the center. Like most performances, you've got a stage, you've got an audience looking at the stage, and the stereo reproduction of your output is intended to just produce kind of a two-dimensional view. I'm sorry, oh, what is that? How many dimensions? You know, just the stereo, right? So it's a creative choice with quadraphonic. Well, where is your audience? Are they still, you know, I mean, presumably in the middle, but then do you still want all of your main content coming from the front? It just opens up a lot of interesting questions. So, but yeah,
are you in the middle? I'm sorry, I'm fascinated by this. Are you in the middle of the quadraphonic speakers when you're performing too in those situations? You're not?
No, at least in this case we were not, just because of the way the room is set up, and it was challenging. Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert at it, but it's definitely fun. It's also, you know, it's also difficult to communicate your quadraphonic output, right? Like, how do you listen to that? You know, how do you deliver a recording to someone intended for quadraphonic sound right now?
Yeah, it's all about live and being in the facility. I've done one performance with a quad setup, and I was like the front speakers. I was right here, so I could hear the back speakers, but I was more in front of the front speakers. And it was fun, like you said. It was cool to just kind of be like, I'm gonna pick this speaker and put something in it. That's kind of how I did it. I didn't have modulation enough to where I could just go around in a circle. I didn't figure out how to make my VCA matrix like line up to the where I could just do that with all the sounds. I kind of had to say, oh, I'm just going to put this sound over there and this one over here and hear what it sounds like. But I saw Fortet one time in San Francisco in a quad setup, and he was in the middle of the room. And that was really cool. Because he was able to do that. I think he had like the planer, some sort of joystick, and he could literally just be like, we're just going to take the whole mix and just swirl it around everybody. And it wasn't like, you know, the most mind-bending thing of like, because it literally was pretty much like the mix just went around. But it was pretty cool because that's just something you don't get to hear a lot. But I think we're so in the beginning of it. And like you said, Tom, like how people don't just have these setups in their houses. When we do get to the point of like, I don't really know about music translating to your surround sound system of your like theater. I don't know anything about that, or if that's really a thing. But I would imagine that that's kind of like where we would kind of hope to take it as far as home listening, or else it's just always in an immersive event environment, which as of right now is still just kind of like on hold.
Yeah, someone mentioned 5.1 on the chat. Like the way to deliver it, in my opinion, is with, you know, there's this new technology, Dolby Atmos, for example, which is actually a 3D sound reproduction system. But it's interesting because it's not really channel dependent. And the reason I say that is it has channels for sound information that isn't tied to the number of output speakers you have. So you can have the same Dolby Atmos recording played back in a 4-channel speaker system or like 56 channels. And the Atmos decoding is what's used to deliver that sound information to the environment. So that's probably where it's going.
And that's all about zones, right? Like basically like you kind of designate what zone a speaker would be in if it was there.
You tell the decoder the geometry and how many channels you have, and it does all the math to figure it out. So the way it works is there's a 5.1 surround bed, and then there's I believe it's a 4.0 overhead, and that's to get 3D sound going. And then you have some number of channels that are, like I said, not tied to a specific geometry of speaker configuration. You know, you can say this, like imagine in cinema, right? You want a helicopter to go all the way around. Well, what you do in Atmos is you record the sound of that helicopter, and then you also encode the movement information into that channel, and the decoder figures out how to place it into the sound field.
Of course.
That
makes sense.
I had a really amazing experience once with a group I hear, and they do dome events. So they do these like a small system to them is like 12 to 20 like speakers, and they set them up.
Yeah, they do 7 in a circle.
So, but for them, the other thing that they also think about is not only the spacing, but also the height. So different heights will do stuff, and they were really into it's kind of screwing with your head with just different frequencies, because obviously you can kind of start doing some really weird stuff depending where you're standing. They have these sounds coming at you, good or bad, to make you feel really weird. And so they wanted to like kind of play around with. So I brought my system over there, and I sent in a bunch of information into their. They had a crazy mixer in there, and they were using a Max software, I think, to like kind of space that out. And yeah, they can kind of like, you can use modulation to kind of tell it where to go. But the one thing I realized, and I wish Frank was here to join us, but yeah, talk about arrangement. You really do have to think about like where you want stuff to be at, because what might sound like a cool idea, it might actually not be what actually happens if you have like a kick drum on one thing going spinning around, and you have a snare going around, because sometimes it sounds great, and other times it sounds so jarring or just broken, depending on what you want it, but like it really can screw around with your head. But I hear you, like it sounds like a really cool idea. Quad seems amazing, but definitely seems like, at least twice as much thought has to go into it.
Yeah, if anybody saw the Kraftwerk in 3D tour, the most recent one, they employed this technology. So it's both, 3D visual with the glasses, but they also had a 3D, I believe it was Atmos, 3D sound mix. So it's pretty crazy.
I was so bummed to miss that. I bought tickets, and then my band had to go on tour, and it was like, well, I guess I'll sell these and go, miss that and go play for like 16 people in a random town. Tour.
All right, so let's keep moving along. Let's talk real quickly. Let's get into mastering, because I know we're behind schedule here, but I love the conversation. That's how it goes. This is a meetup. So we sat down with Nathan Moody, and for some of you who may or may not know, Nathan Moody's really well known in the scene because he talks a lot about doing mastering with a lot of the Eurorack artists, or modular synth artists, I should say. And so he's got a good rep, and he definitely knows it's his daytime job to also do stuff. He also makes music as well. So we sat down and talked to him about mastering, and it is a lot of stuff, and we will at some point release that whole interview. But we had asked him a few questions that we wanted to like play for everybody who's watching in for the group, and get some reaction to it. So, Christoph, I think, do you want me to play it, or let's see. Christoph can hear me or not. I will go ahead and play it.
You played them just to make sure.
So let's start off from the beginning and ask him a question about what is mastering. So here we go, Nathan Moody.
There's a contemporary answer and a historical answer. So the historical answer is that a mastering engineer has typically been the person to take what a mix engineer creates and fully prepares it for mechanical reproduction. So back in the day, of course, that basically just meant for vinyl. These days, it's much more, I think, about an objective third party evaluating your mixes and doing a final polish on processing to make sure that your work translates in the most appropriate way for the broadest audience possible. And the difference there is kind of subtle on the one hand, but what a lot of my clients ask me to do is to really figure out what is the emotional or narrative core of their work, and how can we just tweak the final mixes just slightly to put the right emphasis on their work in terms of emotion, vibe, theme, loudness. And so for contemporary artists, I think the value of mastering is really just objectivity. It's another pair of ears in a different room with a different set of monitors. And hopefully that whole chain from the desk to the monitors to the room is less forgiving than what a mix engineer or even an artist might have in their own studio. So it's a bit more of an objective point of view. And so some people master their own work, which is great. But I think that the real benefit of mastering, and why I, as a mastering engineer, have people master my own music who aren't me, is really that final objective point of view to eliminate the acoustics in your room as a variable and the acoustics in your monitoring setup as a variable to make sure that your work translates in the best way possible for the broadest set of listeners.
Yeah. So Nathan talking about a few things there. Let's get some reactions from that. Anybody want to go first?
He right.
He right. Done. Next.
I think getting the objective point of view that's one of the things, the hardest thing to achieve in a project at that point of the stage. Like after you've tracked it, after you've mixed it. I'm sorry, let me back up. After you've written the piece, after you perform the piece, after you've tracked the piece, after you've mixed the piece, if you've done all of that as the artist, there's been potentially very little objectivity. I mean, even to your best efforts. I mean, I try to trick myself all the time with my own music of like go outside or, walk around the corner or listen around the corner or just listen to somebody else, then I come back, listen to mine or sleep on it and come back. And to my best efforts, it's still me, it's still my work, and I'm still not nearly as objective to the piece as an outside mastering engineer would be. And I'm in full favor of if the budget allows to let a mastering engineer master the project, because if nothing else, for the objective perspective and the collaboration process, it's hugely important in my opinion.
Well, and I think the point that he brings up about how a mastering engineer can help emphasize like the narrative core or like the emotional impact of what the artist is trying to convey is a hugely important role, and it's hard to do that without being objective, right? Because as an artist, you might be particularly like enchanted by some little thing that maybe is actually what's distracting the song from achieving what you're trying to communicate, right? Like it's hard in my own music, I have a difficult time just throwing parts away or admitting to myself like, yeah, that actually doesn't work for the song, right? Whereas somebody else could just say, yeah, you need to just let that go if you want the song to really be better.
Yeah, I think that's like mixing and mastering too. I mean, I think that for me personally, when I listen to my music, it's really hard for me to listen to my music as a whole. And when I listen to other artists, I don't actually pay attention to the arrangement. I don't pay attention about the how loud the bass is or the bass tone. Sometimes I'm like, that's a sick ass bass tone, but I'm not fixated on it, And when I listen to my own music, a lot of times, I can just I will just pick one thing to be listening to the whole time. And it's way easier for me to listen to every aspect of my own music rather than to take it as an overall piece. It's like if a painter just looked at one detail all day and then switched from that detail to another detail, they don't really come back and step 40 feet back and see what it looks like. And, that's a very important part of painting. And that's a really hard thing for me to do as an artist. So I think that's a cool point of at any point giving your music to someone else, because most of the times their first impression of it is going to be as a whole, which is going to be which is the exact same as the people listening to it. at the end purpose is for people to listen to it as a whole. And so I think that that's like a very good point of sending it out, because if you're fixated on something, that person is not going to know what that is and not care. They think is right.
Yeah. And I mean, something not to discount is, a good mastering engineer. We talked earlier about like room treatment and, making sure you've got a good, frame of reference to have even frequency distribution in your room. The mastering engineer has probably spent a lot more time getting that correct in his or her room than any of us will have. And also the tools used for mastering are quite a bit different than for production in some ways, at least. The speakers are more expensive, for example. They're like way more expensive. But also, I mean, little things matter too. Like, a mastering equalizer usually doesn't have a continuous range for boost and cut or frequencies. And the reason for that is reproducibility. They'll have notched, maybe half dB boost and cut, or sometimes just the quality of components are a lot higher in mastering grade equipment. That also goes for audio to digital converters and back. So, that investment in the tool chain and the environment that they use for the listening is part of your investment in hiring the engineer. And then I want to make a couple other points. Some of the more overlooked things about mastering are kind of more nuts and bolts, right? Your mastering engineer is going to know what file format, what sample rate, what metadata to put in there to get those files onto your digital delivery platform. Or the mastering engineer, if you're going to CD, they will make a red book master of your CD. And, if you're building an album instead of just a track that you want mastered, well, those tracks need to sound consistent across each other. You might have a bunch of bangers and then some low volume tracks. We don't want those all as loud as they can be. You want it to tell a story, right, with the relative volumes of each other. In my most recent record, I had a track that I recorded straight to stereo, and there's this big ambient wash thing. And it turned out in the bass region, it had some phasing problems due to just the effects that I was using. And I didn't even notice it, honestly. So my mastering engineer, who was Taylor Dupree, totally recommended, as well as Nathan Moody, he was able to consolidate the bass into mono for that frequency range. And the reason that's important is I was cutting to vinyl. So if you've got phase problems in vinyl in the bass region, it'll pop the needle off the record. It won't be playable. So those kind of nuts and bolts things are like, they're not things that musicians think about or are equipped to handle. So, yeah.
Yeah, one thing about like the equipment coming from the manufacturing side of why like that equipment can be so expensive and things like that is it's also tested to be, like you said, reproduced correctly and like consistent across the range. And testing equipment and like environments are very expensive to have. So just like you use the highest quality components, you do everything you can, but then like you listen to it with your ears on the speakers you have, it sounds good. But then to go through and really say, this is the total harmonic distortion, this is the dynamic range, all of that stuff, like actually going through and doing your due diligence on testing that stuff is another aspect that is really expensive and hard to do, like as an equipment manufacturer, because it's regulation. I guess it's kind of like regulation in other industries.
Cool. So one question that we also then followed up with, because we're talking about modular, is like we were asking what's the difference between mastering modular synth music versus other music, or is there not? So let me play that one for you all, because I love, since everybody here has a background in that too. Since we're talking about mastering in modular synths, what is the difference between mastering a modular synth album versus just an album with these instruments and stuff like that, or is there a difference at all?
That's a great question. I would actually argue there isn't a huge difference. One thing that I find is that a lot of people tend to think that modular systems can create this huge dynamic range, and they can. But what I think is more common is that modular systems create this real frequency range from the infrasonic to the ultrasonic and everything in between. And so that's something that needs some special care and feeding. But you'd be surprised, even VSTs and virtual synths, often in the code that makes these things possible, they often don't filter out like DC offset. So I've gotten a lot of VST-based electronic music where the loudest peak in terms of frequencies is like below 20 hertz, which no one's ever going to hear. So even VSTs can have a lot of infrasonic content. But I think with pure analog synthesis, one of the bigger risks is actually resonances. So people using resonant filters 20 dB per octave or 24 dB per octave or higher in slope, those tend to create these resonances where you might have your filter set at a certain point, and then when your note hits that same point, it might jump 3 to 6 dB in level. And so sometimes that does create a greater dynamic range in a way that doesn't really suit the music. You know, like just because you hit the C as opposed to the C sharp doesn't mean that's a crescendo in energy. It's just the note you happen to hit at that time, as opposed to like verse versus chorus, where the chorus does want to kind of often be lifted up a little bit in terms of energy or impact. So there are some aspects to modular synthesis that one does have to kind of listen for, but the difference between modular music, traditional kind of rock arrangements, or entirely virtual is actually, they're different, but the span is pretty tight as opposed to pretty broad.
Interesting. Yeah, so this is me being naive. I always thought there would be like a really big difference, but that was good to hear, you know, some more explanation about that. And I didn't realize that about VSTs either. I just assumed that they were big, and now I know. So yeah.
Well, one thing that wasn't explained about the DC offset, if you're not aware of what that is, you know, typically what you want your signals to do is audio signals is to hover around 0 volts, right? And, you know, if you compress everything down, and good way to look at it is to do what's called a null test. If you take the exact same signal and you invert it and add it to the original signal, it should be all 0, right? So, sorry?
You shouldn't hear anything, right?
Yeah, there should be no signal there. And you know, that's when it's calibrated to be a true 0. Now, if your signal, instead of hovering between -5 and +5 volts, it hovers between -4 and +6, that means you have a DC offset of 1 volt. And the reason that's important is you're reducing the dynamic range of what you can record, because it's you're not like maximizing the bottom part, and you're kind of overloading the top part, which will sometimes clip. So the DC offset is when that's off. You have to remove that to get the best dynamic range out of your recording.
And to add to that, if I heard Nathan correctly, he was saying that DC offset was in infrasonic range, which the only, my understanding was he saw that on a RTA to be able to see that was down there. And
well, there wouldn't be any sound at all from a DC offset, just because there's no movement in the speaker cone. But I think what he was saying was that some VSTs create their most energy in the infrasonic range, which means that if all that information is there and, you know, bass stuff that you can't even hear, well, it has no purpose, you know, and it can reduce the quality of the recording.
Well, it takes up headroom too.
Right.
And you might just think that they would do it better than someone putting together circuits, but it's just the same thing. I mean, shit still happens.
But by
Clouds
using
is
an
doing that a
RTA,
lot.
you can kind of see issues down there, and then you
Yeah.
can kind of then apply the high pass filter to get rid of, or to get rid of it. Was my thoughts on that. Yeah.
So one thing I didn't think that I heard him mention that I thought was interesting about that question is the difference between direct audio recording in general versus microphone recording. And Aaron, you might have more experience and ways to talk about it, but it's like, I record in this room a lot. I have a little bit of treatment on my ceiling, but I have no treatment on my walls. So it's a relatively live room. Those are basically just like the equivalent of a couch in the room. It kind of sucks up a little bit, but it's not a ton. And so I record drums a lot, and that's like, the thing that I can't wait to master is like learning how to record drums right. But the difference between when you record a band or just live instruments and you get this build up of ambient noise versus instruments that you just plug straight in and then maybe recreate that with like an amp simulator or a room simulator or whatever, just reverb, having that control, I think is kind of an interesting topic. And obviously I'm kind of getting more into mixing rather than mastering, but it's kind of the same idea of just something that I haven't really thought too much about. That is like a difficulty, I think, of recording source material just straight out of the instrument where the frequency range is what you get versus something that's in a room. And now you've got the character of the room, the character of the microphone, and everything else.
Well, and that's what I do almost all day.
Right. Yeah.
Use record microphones. And to your point, I guess, I think everybody gets to know their recording spaces really well if you do it a lot. And having a live sounding room is great. There's nothing wrong with that, in my opinion. And then,
right.
But the way to kind of have more of a direct sound on signals is to kind of use baffles and gobos around the source, whether it be a guitar amp or a person with an acoustic guitar, and you're miking with stereo. I record almost everything in stereo, so
Cool.
so you have that going. But then to talk about phasing, I mean, you're going to get phase as soon as you have two microphones on one source, and I always check phase, and the quickest way for me to do that is using my ears. I click my mono button on my monitor controller, and then I flip the phase on one of the preamps, and if it sounds like shit, then I'm doing a good job. If it sounds better, then I'm out of phase at my source. And sometimes if it's like sounds significantly better, then I'm like, okay, well, I'm just gonna flip the phase on that channel, and it's gonna work great. Or if I click it and it's not noticeably better, that's the problem. That's when I'm out of, because there's a difference between polarity and phase. Phase is somewhere in between 180 degrees. Polarity is just 0 and 180 degrees out. And so if you click the phase button on one channel and there's not a huge noticeably different sound listening in mono, then that's when I definitely go back to one of the microphones, and I start moving them around to hopefully get a better result. But in terms of recording in a space, you learn your space that you have to record in, and then you start. And then here's the problem too, is that if you have a big, large live room and you have 3 different musicians in there, and you don't have any control or any baffling between the sources, then you're going to have bleed into the different microphones, and then that in itself, from like the bass amp into the guitar amp, can bleed, but then also that in itself can cause phasing issues of the bass of the bleed into the guitar amp. So there's all kinds of reasons why you want to kind of watch your sources if you're recording live, and have some kind of control over that. And not to say that you need isolation, 100% isolation, unless you want to be able to overdub. But yeah, it's phase and DC offset and all that stuff it's very real things. And I think, in my opinion, that's what if you go to a studio or pay for a mastering engineer, that's what you're a part of what you're paying for, is their expertise to be able to, like Tom mentioned, recognize that the low end is out of phase. And how did the mastering engineer discover that? He knows his tools, and he has his tricks, and he knows how to monitor the low end for to checking phase correlation. And he
And
discovered
doesn't forget to do it.
Yeah,
especially
yeah.
if you're cutting to vinyl. Yeah, you have to.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
exactly.
So that's something I thought that kind of came out from that conversation with Nathan. Is that he's talking about things that, like, to me, I would have to look up to even figure out what it is. I wouldn't really look for it. You know, he's sitting there, he's doing it all the time. He's like, oh, okay, well, you know, this album was cut as it was made from with the Buchla. I've worked with stuff from Buchla, so maybe I should look out for these things. I think he mentions that, like, you know, you have a certain thing you kind of look out for. Maybe it's because there's certain characteristics with certain instruments. Like you're talking about drums. Like, you know, there's certain challenges and opportunities with drums and mastering drums. So if you do it over and over again, then you're going to pick up on it. Another reason why I personally think it's a good idea to ship it out to somebody who is thinking that way, because I definitely couldn't. I don't have time.
Well, yeah, and that's another thing is, like, I was just wondering about, like, the difference between mastering a record that's pretty much all point source, like, recordings of direct in, and all ambience is synthesized, versus mastering something that is has been multi-tracked with just, you know, purely microphones. There's obviously different things you probably have to look out for.
I can speak to one observation about that, and that's I noticed that in my ambient music and modular, there's a lot less high-end frequency content. Like
Okay.
in acoustic music,
Air.
Yeah, in acoustic music, and like I'm above, you know, it goes off the chart. There's content over 20K, you know, and yeah, you're EQing above 20K to add some quote unquote air. And in modular, it's, you know, at least for my stuff, it kind of tops out between, I don't know, 8K, I guess, ish. I mean, where there's content, and even that isn't really fundamentals in my opinion. It's kind of, it's overtones. But then above that, if I'm using tapes, if I'm using like micro cassettes or tape loops, then that's kind of where the textural stuff is too. And I guess what I've discovered too is that with that kind of hiss, that hiss is cool, and I love that hiss of the tape, for example. But then as soon as I start limiting or making it kind of loud, then it gets pretty noticeable, and then it's a creative choice of like, is that too much? Mm-hmm. That's kind of one thing that I guess my biggest point here is that there's less high end in a modular kind of direct modular music that I've noticed so far.
Do you think that's why? Sorry, do you think that's why? Because I'm thinking about, like, you know, ads I've seen from watching so many YouTube videos about synthesizers. I feel like there's a lot of you know, muddy up, or like make your song sound retro, or like it's like a tape emulation, because these instruments don't have that. We don't have microphones hooked up to a morphogene or anything. So
well, and our recorders are meant to record awesome, and they're meant to record clear. And every like thing that you get now, any recording interface you get, whether it's cheap or expensive, the preamps in it are meant to be as clean as they can be for the price point. The converters are meant to be as clean as they can be for the price point. And then people start paying, you know, absurd amounts of money for things that will add color on the way in, such as different preamps that have different characters, and things like that. And when you're talking about those lo-fi recordings, it's like, I mean, you're like emulating me recording on my Marantz when I was 8. You know,
it's a great sound. It's awesome.
Yeah.
And it sounds awesome. And I'm personally doing that a ton right now. And that, like, the lo-fi like emulation thing, the tape emulation has been a huge part of something that I've been into. And my question for the group is, so, like, what's the difference between me, or like, I guess, where should I stop? Because what I'm starting to do now is adding a lot of character on my master, right? And it's like, I find that I'm starting to darken up my master because I want it to sound a little bit older. I'm adding multiband compression, and I'm adding some things to just try and give it more of but I'm also, like, the main really thing I'm doing is distorting and darkening. And that's kind of giving it a sound. And I'm like, oh, this is something I should be having my mastering engineer do because they're good at this, right? But at the same time, when we talk a lot about mastering, we talk about making your mix translate. Their job isn't to add a ton of color. So I'm kind of wondering, like, where I walk this line of, like, I'm trying to add color to my master, and, you know, is that something I should have a conversation with somebody about, or is that something I should just do, but then take the limiter off and give them the mix with some headroom, or, you know, those kind of things?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, because it you know, at first, Alex, when you were describing that, my thought was, you know, still do it, but use that as a reference for your mastering engineer. But, you know, if you're using specific tools to introduce, you know, colorful distortion or things like that, I mean, the mastering engineer may not have those tools. One of the ways that Nathan likes to work, I've worked with him before, is it's really about a conversation. That brings me to a point I wanted to make about working with a mix engineer or a mastering engineer in general. You'll learn a lot, right? Like sometimes, like a bad. What's that?
I said that's what Christoph said. I think he worked with Nathan, and he said, "I learned so much."
Nathan's actually he really wants to work with you to help you achieve the goal. And you know, when I worked with him, you know, the first couple of mixes, I was like, you know, that's not really what I was going for. And we had a conversation about, you know, the goals that I had, and it came back and, hey, you know what? Not only was it great, I learned some things in the whole process. So I don't know. Yeah, I think it's a good question, Alex. It's probably one where you want to develop some kind of relationship with the engineer and say, hey, this is what I'm going for. Here's the example. They may want to work with the master that you've created, or they may want to say, like, oh, go back and try something else. Something Nathan says a lot is, like, be prepared to go back into your mix, you know, if possible, to make some of those mix changes so that your goals for the master can come out, you know, as good as they can be.
Yeah, that's a good point. I've done that a lot with mix engineers. And then every time I've sent stuff off to mastering, to be honest, I get it back and I'm like, dope, this sounds great. Like, I've never really had to just be like, to go back and forth too many times. But with mixing, the mixing engineer I use is a good friend of mine. And so when I do choose to use him, a lot of times I'll send out my tracks and I'll say, here's where I got it. And then I'll send it with everything off. And then sometimes he'll be like, well, just send me your vocal track with the delay and the compression and everything on it, because I'm having a hard time getting the vocal character that you're looking for. So that's an interesting point for sure.
When I worked with Nathan, one thing that was even more helpful than getting a great sounding product out of it, but he offers mix reviews. So basically an hour we spend listening to my track that I mixed on headphones, you know, and he basically said, look, here's what I would do to this, right? First we listened to the whole thing, and then he said, look, here's what I would do. And he had listened to it before, but we listened to it again, and then he pointed out certain things where I could go back and make my mix better, so then ultimately, you know, the master would be better. And one thing that he said, which is interesting, Alex, that you were talking about, you know, the direct out and the clean recording that you get, and that is the concept of reamping. So basically taking your direct out, putting it through a speaker, and putting a microphone in front of it, and how that, the room and all those kind of things can really help with this, like, atmospheric stuff, specifically with ambient music. Yeah. It's not something I did on that track, but on some other music that I did now is I just did that. I have a huge basement and I put a microphone in there and just played it through a guitar amp and just tried that. And it sure enough, it added some character that I couldn't get with tape emulation plugins. And I have cassette tape recordings and all that, but it's just an interesting perspective. And that was something that he provided. Just, you know, like Tom said, by talking about the music, he was asking really detailed questions. What do you want to go for? What is your reference recordings? And I'm like, reference what? I don't have any reference recordings, right? So it made me think a lot about that kind of stuff.
So when you started doing the reamping, just out of curiosity, did you end up doing it in a parallel manner where you had both the original source and the reamped signal?
Yeah, I have. So I played a guitar track that I recorded through with effects and everything. The whole just the stereo mix through a guitar amp, and then I recorded an up close mic, and I recorded a condenser mic in the room. Just I have 9-foot ceilings here, so it's a big room, and I put that right up there. And for my amateur first try kind of thing, I thought it sounded good. The one thing that I noticed to what Aaron said is that the room recording, check the face, right? But the room recording is a lot brighter, right? But probably because of the condenser. But that
and the walls and everything,
it added something to it that I have exactly the same impression that Aaron says, that the music, our music is similar in some cases, and it's like 8K or 9K, and then there's nothing there, right? So you can put a lot of noise up there and just do some splashes, but like the content is really up in that area.
Yeah, well, and a microphone proximity effect too. A close mic's going to get a lot more lower stuff, where the one that's further away is going to sound like it has a high pass on it.
And also the distance air is the best compressor. I mean, in my opinion. I mean, and the further away you get put the microphone, it's going to compress naturally.
Cool.
So and it's also going to give you that kind of umami. Which hand am I? Okay, that kind of thing.
Umami,
That you can. It's yes, you can do it through a direct source, but if you can reamp it and get that kind of that distance from the speaker to your microphone, whatever the signal chain is, I mean, that's going to give you that texture that's going to speak to your subconscious. And speaking of that for a second, Alex, to go back to your comment about well, should I add that kind of coloration to my master or not? And just to speak to that, because I do have opinions or thoughts about that. And I think if you're going for a particular thing like coloration, then yes, that's your creative choice, and I think that you should by all means do that. And if nothing else, just provide two final mixes, one with the source and one without the source of that provides that coloration. But also then communicate that, it sounds like I've never worked with Nathan, but it sounds like he's great at communicating, which is key in my opinion with any working relationship, is that you communicate hey, this is what I'm going for. You might notice this, and that's intentional, and that's the vibe I'm going for. And then that's going to be picked up on as intentional.
Right.
And then the other thing about mastering and mixing is actually using tape, real printing your mixes to tape. And my studio, I have a 2.5-inch 2-track tape machine that 9.5 out of 10 projects the clients want me to print the mixes to tape. And so then the mastering facility that I work with a lot has exactly the same tape machine that I do, and so I print the tones, the calibration tones on the front reel, and then they calibrate their machine to my tones, and then they're mastering off of the tape reels that I've provided them. All that said, I still provide them with the Dropbox link of the digital files, and they can A/B, and of course they're going to choose whichever the one's going to translate the best. But in my opinion, I bring that up only because you're talking about that coloration, that kind of again, that umami kind of thing.
Yeah.
I think that's a creative choice, and I think the mastering engineer has that should have the option of using that or not using that. But from your end, from the client's end of the perspective, providing that kind of material or content then provides them with more information to work with.
Right. And I think like we've said, the conversation is the big deal. Having that conversation, communicating is always, the number one. I've always found that, just talking to people, and like you said, I have a track I have right now that has a ton of clipped out drums, and it's no, it's on purpose. That's why I want it to sound like the 90s, just poor MPC sampling. That's what I want it to sound like. But yeah, just communicating that's a big deal, and finding someone that with all this stuff in music in general, it's kind of finding the people that you like, that you gel with, and then developing that relationship. And that's kind of on every aspect, whether it's the creative, the production, or the actual promotional side of things. Everything is just communication and real connection with people.
So you guys are making some really good arguments on why you want to work with a real person at this critical stage before putting stuff out. Now, I think there's an argument for when you need to use software or doing it yourself, whether it's time or what the project is. If you just want to throw a sketch up on, you know, SoundCloud or something, and it's kind of like, hey, it's my work in progress, or you're just doing something with Instagram, or you're not ready to like put something out like straight up. Like I get that, and there's probably some people even in our community who are, you know, like I use this service, it's good, it's whatever, it works, and they figured out how to work with that software or that, you know, outsourcing stuff. But I like hearing all this conversation because I feel like just going back and forth with that is gonna like make me smarter and learn more about like what's happening after I send it to you, and having those conversations and also like kind of checking like where the artistry like stops and where the technical part begins, you know, and how that kind of blurs. I think that's kind of an interesting aspect. So I just want to say that, you know, I know we're kind of getting closer to the time. We're past our time that I thought I was going to be on, but I want to say I think that's really cool. So not to cut us all off on this, I think we keep talking about it. I do want to like touch on a few other real quick things before we do wrap up and have heckseven play the end. So I won't be able to play all the clips from Nathan's stuff, but we will play the host. We will run his show afterwards, and maybe we'll do like a premiere or something, and we could jump on there and chat on it this week or something. But you know, I want to make sure everybody here gets a chance to talk a little bit about what they're doing and like their availability or more about, you know, you guys, what's going on in you know, audio engineering wise. So Double A, can you go first and kind of tell us a little bit, like, you know, how people can get to know about you and different ways they might be able to utilize you.
Utilize. Sure. Yeah. My recording studio is located in Fort Collins, Colorado. It's called Swing Fingers Recording Studio. It's located west of town, up in the foothills. So that Swing Fingers there's a website on the internet, and also Instagram, Swing Fingers, and I record and mix. I don't advertise myself as any kind of mastering engineer, but yeah, that's my day job. I do it full time, and also play ambient music as Double A.
Yeah, so good. Thank you so much. Grant, you want to tell us a little bit what you're working on and how? And I know you've done mastering work for me, and I know you.
Yeah, I would advertise myself primarily as a creative tool to be used in the. Just creative tool. We'll just stop at creative tool.
I'm just a tool.
I'm just a creative tool. Yeah, I mean, my forte is definitely mixing and mastering for digital purposes, right? Like, I'm not set up for hardcore, professional mastering. But if you want a second opinion, somebody to help you really emphasize what you're trying to say in your music, clean it up for Bandcamp, or if you're an idiot like me who always puts out CDs, I'm good with that as well. Yeah, because I felt like there's a little market of people, right, that they need mastering, but it doesn't need to be for like a giant run of vinyl, or they just don't have the budget, right, for some of the more like very established mastering services out there. So that's in a nutshell what I do for mastering, but I also do it is for mixing as well. But creative tool, more or less. Yeah.
That's awesome. Tom, I know you're doing other stuff too. Do you ever help people with this stuff? Or?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I'm available on a contract basis or for mentorship. I have helped with digital mastering before and some mix engineering. I do my own music, and I'd like to, actually, I'm not sure if this idea will work, but I got this studio full of like really great stuff, and you know, if you're interested to like play some of your sequences through or like record through some of this gear, I think that'd be a really fun thing to collaborate on and try. So the way to find me is just tombutcher.com. I've got a page set up that's got, you know, my contact information on there. So I really like mentoring people and teaching what I've learned, at least, you know, from my perspective. And specifically on the modular or a synthesizer side, I'm one of the co-founders of Patchworks, and we love helping people out, you know, with questions and getting you the right gear. So you can also find me at patchworks.com.
No, that's awesome. I appreciate you coming out here and jumping on here, and we're definitely I wanna explore Patchworks more. I wish I could go down there and check out the store and talk more like about gear, especially when it comes to recording stuff. So for sure.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Alex,
Um,
I know you're always busy. I know you're.
So I am not available. I used to record bands, and I liked doing it, and I was always about doing like garage rock punk bands. And my whole thing was like, I'm gonna make you sound like you, and then I'm gonna deliver you something that you can either keep working on or you can release, and it's a good demo tracks. I don't really do that as much anymore. Didn't really love running the studio, especially just kind of like waiting on people to show up and that whole thing that kind of goes on with working in a studio. So I just make my own music, and I did a record last year that I recorded in a similar way to what you're talking about, Tom. So I made I did a bunch of tracks, and I had all the MIDI information, and then I went to a studio in LA, and I re-recorded all the tracks with the MIDI information through a bunch of synths that they had. And so it has like a Jupiter 8, a Memory Moog, Prophet 5, like, you know, Model D. It has everything that you can imagine, you know, on that record, and it's a really cool service. And I would just say I would be down to talk to you about maybe trying to figure out a way to do that remotely, because that could be cool. Me send you information, listen to stuff back. I think that would be a fun avenue to go down. And then as far as like mixing and mastering, I'll be hitting the rest of you guys up. I mean, and I'm available to talk about synthesis and music production all the time. I do like private lessons with modular and stuff like that, trying to help people out. I love spreading the knowledge, all about that. But yeah, as far as like recording, mixing, mastering right now, I'm kind of on that same journey where I'm figuring it out. And I think that like it's kind of the best advice that I've ever gotten, and it's the advice I give to everyone trying to get into anything, is just do it. And if you want to get into it, then do it. And if you want to get into finishing tracks, then start finishing tracks. And if you don't feel like you need to be the person doing the mastering or the mixing or whatever, then just start finishing the tracks and start sending them off and get started on whatever part of it is. If you just got to start, you know, putting notes in the sequencer, then do that. I think the best thing is just go for it. Just start going. And right now, like I make a ton of music, and I like to mix. I'm like learning how to mix, and I'm enjoying it. But I don't think it's something that I need to offer to other people. I think there are other people that have much more of an ear that hasn't been damaged by years of touring, probably.
That's awesome. Well, that's awesome. We'll put links in the comments, and we've dropped some in the chat as well. You know, it's awesome. I think there's a lot of good resources here. Unfortunately, Rosanna had to bounce out. She had another thing going on with her studio. Look her up, pick up her information. I think she's got an email. You can hit her up, and she knows a ton about recording as well. She knows a lot of DIY stuff. Like she could, you know, help the budget-minded person too. So I think that's cool. You know, I just want to just a few things real quick before we go to heckseven. This is we're doing a monthly meetup or an event every fourth Sunday of the month. So do subscribe. Thank you for the likes. Appreciate the comments. You know, hopefully we'll be doing more and more shows that get more technical. We'll follow up with the Nathan Moody interview in its entirety. We also have a Beyond the Patch interview with Nathan talking about just the artistic journey he goes through. We have a festival coming probably in July. There's a lot of stuff going on. So head over to their website and subscribe to the email. You can sign up for Critique, which is happening actually pretty soon, right? Events and shows coming up. And also, a little quick plug. We just got our stickers made. I don't know if you can see that. Anyhow, put it upside down. Well, anyhow. Head to our site. I had 100 of these made. We don't have a way of doing fundraisers anymore. So if you head to our site, we're doing a fundraiser bundle. $3.50 is what we're asking. If you can give more, that's awesome. That money helps us support the show. So get these awesome stickers. They are like, you can put them in dishwashers. You can put them on the bumper of your car, on your helmet, on your skateboard, on your water bottle, on your tongue. I'm joking, don't do that. But this is true, yeah. So definitely pick these up and support the cause. Thanks everybody for watching. We're gonna head out with the music of heckseven, and be sure to follow us on Instagram and hit us up if you need an invite to our Discord. Oh, and also, sorry, one last thing. I just found out there is a clubhouse, Eurorack clubhouse group meeting every Sunday. So if you're into that, there's another group. All to say, you're not alone out there. You got friends in modular spaces.
What is that? Where is that? Is that a Discord?
That's the new Clubhouse. Is that new app where it's like all audio? I'll send you an invite. Yeah.
Cool.
I'll send. Yeah, I think I have some invites, and there's some people out there. Look up Stu. He knows all that stuff. So yeah.
All right, I'll hit Stu up.
Yeah, I got invites. I'll hit you up. So yeah, let's keep talking. All right. Much love, everybody. Be safe. Be good. All right. heckseven, take us out.
Let's start with some drone.
Take care, everybody.
Have a good one.